Chapter 2534. To divide the reality into countless dimensions. Of course, it was not just a matter of thinking and changing one's perception. After all, the reality was the reality. It was not a level that could be changed at, well, like the illusory level. In order to change the state of the reality, other than existing in the reality but not knowing about it due to lack of knowledge and so on, it required a sufficiently strong willpower to change the state of the reality. For example, the origin of the natural order existed. It was only because of its unique characteristics that it did not exist for cultivators who did not know of its existence. For such an existence, as long as one could recognize it, one did not need any will to discover it and feel its influence. In addition, there was also the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. That level was an endless existence for those who knew about it, but it did not exist for those who did not know about it. Such an existence also existed. Similarly, one did not need any will to discover it. As long as one was aware of its existence, one could discover it and enter that gap. For example, at this very moment, the reality was formed by countless layers of the body, spirit, power, life source, magic treasures, and so on. This was not a characteristic that truly existed in the reality itself. Perhaps some areas of the reality could be divided into countless dimensions, but the definition of dimensions was not like this. Instead, it should be more similar to the existence of space-time dimensions. Therefore, at this moment, if one wanted to divide the reality into countless dimensions in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, one would need a strong will to do it. Moreover, even if one could do it, it would only be temporary. When one's will was withdrawn, the reality would eventually return to its original state. Obviously, the stronger one's will was, the greater the change one could make to the reality. If Luo Fan relied on his cultivation realm of a sixth tribulation expert and his strong will after surviving six tribulations, it was also possible to divide the reality into such dimensions. However, the number of dimensions he could divide was quite limited, at most a few hundred or a few thousand. Even for some existences like the light of heaven and earth, it was impossible to divide them into a certain dimension. Instead, one would have to rely on such existences to communicate with the dimensions that they had divided. Only by relying on a will that was more powerful than his own could he increase the number of dimensions without limit. Only by relying on a will that was even more powerful than his own could he gather an unbelievable existence like the light of the world into a certain dimension, preventing everything in other dimensions from being protected by it. This was originally an almost impossible task. However, for Luo Fan, or for anyone who had cultivated to a certain level in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, it was not impossible, because they had the existence of the light of heaven and earth, which was almost like a cheat. The light of heaven and earth contained the will of heaven and earth. This kind of will was many times stronger than the will of the living beings. Even if it was Luo Fan's will, compared to the will of the world, was still extremely small. Before one became a true saint, the will of any existence was equally small compared to the will of the world. In this way, this impossible mission was no longer impossible. When a cultivator could make use of the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth, he would be able to concentrate the light of heaven and earth into a certain dimension and easily bypass the defense of the light of heaven and earth and eliminate his opponent. This was what Luo Fan had done just now. In fact, this was what the cultivator with the dark red face had done earlier. Of course, compared to Luo Fan, who had just comprehended it, the light of the world was still behind him, and there was still a concrete manifestation. The light of heaven and earth of that dark red cultivator had already undergone many changes that Luo Fan still couldn't understand. It had completely disappeared. The battle, just now, was a battle between Luo Fan and the cultivator with a dark red complexion based on their own understanding of the dimensional division. Luo Fan launched his attack into the countless dimensions that appeared under his altered perception. He wanted to bypass all of the young man's defenses and erase him through the countless dimensions. What the young man had to do was to insert his defenses into the countless dimensions that appeared under his altered perception and defend against Luo Fan's attack. In this way, the outcome of the battle would be very easy to determine. As long as one of them could change more dimensions, the one who would emerge victorious would be the one who would emerge victorious. If Luo Fan had more dimensions, then his attack on some dimensions would be able to bypass all defenses and hit the dark red complexion young man in front of him. If the young man had more dimensions, then he would be able to intercept Luo Fan's attack on all dimensions and even counterattack, erasing Luo Fan from those dimensions. The final result was very obvious. The number of dimensions that Luo Fan knew was obviously more than the dark red complexion young man. The reason for this was even simpler. It was because what supported Luo Fan was his light of heaven and earth. On the other hand, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had devoured billions and trillions of heaven and earth during his sixth tribulation. With so many heavens and earth stacked together, the light of heaven and earth had already been sublimated to a level that was far beyond the light of heaven and earth of other cultivators. Obviously, the dark red complexion cultivator was no match for him. Therefore, although he had blocked most of the dimensional attacks, there were still some that he had missed. This led to his failure. "You won?" At this time, Jiayu Fairy's incredulous voice came from not far away. At this time, there was only a look of disbelief on her face. It was as absurd as seeing a mortal pressing a supreme god to the ground and rubbing him. After all, this was the 5th level of the Town Master's Path. Although the cultivator in front of her was much stronger than the average 5th level of the Town Master's Path, he seemed to be somewhat inferior to her in some aspects. However, it was such an existence that easily defeated an existence that she was far from being comparable to. How could she not feel incredulous? How could she not feel puzzled? "It's just an aura," Luo Fan said lightly. At this time, he did not let his guard down. Instead, he was still paying attention to all areas of the entire forbidden area, paying attention to all the possible changes that might occur here. He believed that the dark red complexion young man would never be able to swallow being pressed to the ground and rubbed by an ant in his eyes. Next, he would definitely have other means, and it was even possible that his real body would appear here to fight with him. In other words, although he had defeated that aura, it was just the beginning. At this time, an incomparably shocking pressure was born from nothingness, directly covering the entire forbidden area and pouring into all areas of the forbidden area, including where Luo Fan was, where Jiayu Fairy was, and even the continent of the tower. At this moment, all areas that were not supported by the roots of Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth produced an earth-shattering riot. This riot was so strong that it even seemed that these areas were about to collapse and disappear, releasing all the power to completely destroy everything that fell on them. Fortunately, at this time, the continent of the tower had been completely wrapped up by the roots released by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth from top to bottom, inside and out. Not a single thing was left out. It was precisely because of this that although the pressure was terrifying, it did not cause any problems to the continent of the tower in the end. At this time, Jiayu Fairy could not care about anything else at all. At this moment, her expression had become extremely ugly. The power inside her body was constantly surging, try her best to resist all the pressure around her, resisting the destruction that appeared out of nowhere. The pressure was really too much. Even though Jiayu Fairy was from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road, she could not resist this kind of pressure. Under this pressure, her body burst into countless pieces of flesh and blood. The scene was unimaginably tragic. It could be said that if Jiayu Fairy was not a 6th tribulation expert, this kind of change would have been enough to take her life. However, even if it did not take her life, this kind of change alone was enough to seriously damage her vitality, and she would not be able to recover for a long time. The pieces of flesh and blood did not directly dissipate, but with great difficulty turned into a strange mass of blood, constantly wriggling in the light, trying to condense into a human shape, but it did not have the strength to do so. At this time, Luo Fan was in no mood to pay attention to Jiayu Fairy. He knew that the dark-faced young man had come. Moreover, this time, it was not just an aura like before, but a more powerful existence. It could be an incarnation, a doppelganger, or even a real body. In the face of such an enemy, Luo Fan's eyes showed a kind of expectation. A powerful enemy could bring him a powerful understanding, just like the previous attack that penetrated all dimensions. If he had not seen it from the dark-faced cultivator, he did not know when he would have been able to understand it. You deserve to die. At this time, a cold voice that seemed to come from the 9 serenities of hell came into Luo Fan's ears. Hearing this voice, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he said, "Sure enough, you have come. I heard that if you 7th-level cultivators go against the Tao Master's Road by 2 levels, you will pay a great price. You have already paid a great price to send your aura down just now. This time, you have come down after such a short time. Can you really bear this price?" His words made the invisible pressure release from the pressure become more and more terrifying. "As long as I can erase you, everything will be worth it." Then the voice came again. Compared to before, this voice was even colder, and the anger and violence in it became stronger. Then, a figure appeared out of thin air not far from Luo Fan. This figure was the cultivator with a dark red face. However, compared to the appearance that was condensed from an aura before, now, he was a real body of flesh and blood. The aura released from his body, compared to the previous body that was condensed from an aura, was dozens or hundreds of times stronger. The surrounding light was suppressed by his aura, and the originally extremely violent and raging state turned into a calm, like flowing water. Moreover, the area affected was more than 10,000 times larger than the area affected by the previous body formed from an aura. "It's just a doppelganger. I thought you would lose your mind and send your real body down." Luo Fan looked at it and could not help but feel a little disappointed. Obviously, sending his real body down and sending his doppelganger down were completely different. If he sent his real body down, once his aura was exposed, he would definitely suffer unimaginable punishment from the Tao Master's prison. Being suppressed for 1,000,000,000 years was just the worst punishment, and it was not impossible for him to directly drop his cultivation level. But sending his doppelganger down was different. Although once discovered by the Tao Master's prison, the punishment would be extremely terrifying compared to sending his real body down. There was still some room for redemption. Although, even if there was a redemption, it was not a big deal for a cultivator of this level. The dark red cultivator's expression became even more furious. "Don't think that you're so great just because you destroyed my aura just now." His words seemed to be spat out from between his teeth, full of strong, killing intent. "Oh, it seems that you have a stronger method. Then what are you waiting for? Quickly show it. I can't wait any longer." Luo Fan's eyes moved, and a look of anticipation appeared on his face. "Do you think you have no scruples just because you have a method of resurrection? Then let me see how many times you can resurrect." The dark-faced cultivator obviously could not be bothered to talk nonsense with Luo Fan at this time. At this moment, he raised his hand, and a ball appeared in his hand. After the ball appeared, it rotated rapidly in the void and began to release endless light and heat. Infinite power was constantly released from it, and in an instant, an unknown amount of light was completely wiped out. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the barrier between the levels was being squeezed at an alarming rate. This pressure completely deformed the barrier, and even affected the communication between the various levels, causing it to become a little blurry. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan finally looked slightly serious. Chapter 25:35. The dark red-faced young man sneered and shook the ball in his hand that was emitting infinite light and heat. Suddenly, there were endless strange fluctuations around the ball. These fluctuations came wave after wave, layer upon layer, like endless waves that were constantly surging. They kept piling up and frantically released in all directions. During this process, Luo Fan felt that the endless roots that were spreading out from the light of heaven and earth that he had released collapsed in an instant. Countless roots seemed to have been thrown into a blender. Starting from the tiniest details, they were completely broken, as if they were formed by the accumulation of countless tiny fragments. Now, the pressure that restricted the existence of these fragments had completely collapsed, causing these roots to completely turn into smoke in the blink of an eye. This change did not affect a large area. It only enveloped the area around Luo Fan and the dark red-faced young man. In terms of spatial area, it was probably only about 10 million miles. Of course, in this forbidden area that was filled with light similar to the light of heaven and earth, the form of existence of space was certainly not the same as the space in the normal world. This kind of measurement of 10 million miles actually did not have much meaning. Such a range was actually insignificant compared to the entire forbidden area. However, it was already enough to envelop Luo Fan. With this change, Luo Fan felt that his ability to control the light within this area was suddenly greatly weakened. It almost felt like he had returned to the state before he completely refined this forbidden area. Now, let me see what other tricks you have. The dark red-faced young man said. His figure swayed, and his fist had already fiercely imprinted on Luo Fan's chest. Boom! Infinite power completely erupted at this moment. This power wasn't just pure destructive power. Instead, it contained endless mysterious power that was unique to all aspects. Amidst this power, there seemed to be billions and trillions of space-time being born. It also seemed to be directly penetrating through the endless dimensions to attack Luo Fan's various existences. There were also all kinds of indescribable and bizarre magical abilities frantically pouring into Luo Fan's body, and all kinds of exquisite and unpredictable combinations were carried out, transforming into all kinds of unimaginable effects. Crazy destruction, change, creation, distortion. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan's reaction was absolutely fast. The surrounding roots of the light of heaven and earth had already been crushed by the dark red-faced cultivator's means. However, this cultivator still underestimated Luo Fan after all. If it was an ordinary 5th or 6th tribulation powerhouse, facing such an encounter where the extension of their own light of heaven and earth was crushed, they would definitely be severely injured. They might even lose the ability to resist in a short period of time because of the backlash from the light of heaven and earth. Obviously, Luo Fan was not an ordinary 5th or 6th tribulation powerhouse. His light of heaven and earth had devoured so many perfect worlds. Even if they were replicated, they were still perfect worlds. In this way, his light of heaven and earth was already billions of times more powerful than the light of heaven and earth of ordinary 5th or 6th tribulation powerhouses. Under such circumstances, how could the loss of the roots of the light of heaven and earth affect Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth? How much of a backlash would it bring to him? At this moment, Luo Fan instantly used the power that he had extracted from the light of heaven and earth. Countless changes occurred in his body, and the endless power that the dark red-faced cultivator blasted out was instantly neutralized. Then his body shook, and he raised his hand and punched with endless power. Using the method of connecting the dimensions, he punched towards the dark red-faced cultivator in front of him. This punch caused the cultivator's expression to freeze. However, he was still extraordinary after all, and it was impossible for him to be hit so easily. At this time, his body flashed, and his other hand suddenly blasted out a punch. It streaked across a mysterious trajectory that couldn't be described with words, and directly collided with Luo Fan's fist. The dimensions actually increased. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. It turned out that the cultivator's fist actually connected the same number of dimensions, completely blocking every attack that Luo Fan sent into each dimension. This caused Luo Fan, who should have been able to easily deal with his opponent, to return empty-handed. There was a huge difference between this and the strength displayed by the body, formed by the aura. Is it that thing? As he thought of this, he separated from the cultivator and glanced at the ball that was floating in the void, releasing endless light and heat, and releasing endless strange fluctuations. It was impossible for the connected dimensions to grow so much in such a short time. Moreover, it was impossible for it to grow so much that he could connect the same number of dimensions. Therefore, the reason why this dark red-faced cultivator was able to block Luo Fan's attack was clearly not because of his own strength, but because he borrowed some kind of external force. At this moment, the only external force was that ball that could even affect Luo Fan's communication with the other dimensions. At this moment, countless roots that extended from the light of the world appeared outside the area that was surrounded by the ball, forming an extremely tight encirclement, completely covering all directions. The dark red-faced cultivator did not care at all about the changes in the outside world at this moment. At this moment, his gaze was completely focused on Luo Fan. Seeing that Luo Fan was retreating, he raised his hand and waved it in the void. Endless power descended out of nowhere, forming countless complex and indescribable shapes in the void, forming all kinds of inconceivable things that pressed down on Luo Fan. As these powers pressed down, Luo Fan felt unimaginable pressure acting on him, fiercely pressing down on his body, his soul, his life source, and his imprint. Although he hadn't connected the dimensions yet, at this moment, he felt as if all his dimensions were equally accepting this kind of pressure. An inexplicable joy flashed in Luo Fan's eyes at this moment. There's something new again. He looked at the strange structure formed by the power above, and traces of understanding flashed in his eyes. All sorts of subtle principles and profound mysteries were constantly pouring into his heart, allowing him to quickly comprehend them. Bang! The power acted on Luo Fan's body without holding back, directly destroying Luo Fan's body. Even his life source, his imprint, and everything else were completely destroyed. In the face of such a change, the dark red-faced cultivator did not relax at all, nor did he feel the slightest bit pleased. He had not stopped moving at all. With a wave of his hand, the power suddenly collapsed, but in the next moment, it condensed out of nowhere and quickly condensed towards the light of heaven and earth that had appeared in the void after Luo Fan disappeared. It directly pressed down on the light of heaven and earth. This kind of pressure might be quite terrifying for a cultivator, and even Luo Fan could feel that he was faintly unable to bear it. However, compared to the light of heaven and earth, this kind of pressure was nothing at all. Even the instinct of the light of heaven and earth was not aroused. The light of heaven and earth did not even change in the slightest because of this. It was still hovering there as if nothing had happened. What a powerful light of heaven and earth! However, no matter how powerful it is impossible to dodge it. At this moment, the power suddenly rotated rapidly, and the surrounding light produced indescribable distortions. The forbidden area seemed to be unable to bear the changes of this power, and was about to crack indescribably. Then, with a soft poof, the forbidden area shattered, and a gray, chaotic state instantly appeared behind the hole created by the crack in the forbidden area. The power rotated at this moment, maintaining the hole while continuously sinking into the back of the hole. Behind the hole was obviously the chaotic state. At this moment, the terrifying power released by the dark red-faced cultivator was obviously using a special method to pull the light of heaven and earth into the chaotic state. Obviously, although it was not known what method Luo Fan used to resurrect from the dead, this cultivator placed the source of his resurrection on the light of heaven and earth. This was also natural. After all, for the 5, 6, and 7 tribulation powerhouses, the existence of the light of heaven and earth was profound and unfathomable. It was not surprising that it could derive any power. Although resurrection from the dead was strange, it was not impossible. Therefore, it was clear that in the eyes of this cultivator, all traces of Luo Fan would be completely erased after the light of the world was sent into the state of chaos. Although the light of heaven and earth had the will of the world and was said to be able to transform into a perfect world after it matured, it was not a truly perfect world after all. The will of the world was not complete, and the will of the world was not perfect either. Under such circumstances, sending the light of heaven and earth into the chaotic state meant that there was only one outcome for the light of heaven and earth. That was to be completely destroyed, assimilated, and devoured by the chaotic state until it disappeared without a trace. The only difference was that compared to ordinary cultivators, the light of heaven and earth could last a little longer. I have no intention of giving up on the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, a voice entered the ears of the dark red-faced cultivator. Then his expression froze. The boundless light and heat in the surroundings abruptly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, the entire region returned to its original state. Only the boundless light that existed in the forbidden ground was still there like the background. Oh no! At this moment, how could the cultivator not know what was going on? He quickly gave up on Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, and quickly shifted his attention to the ball that he had summoned earlier, that was emitting endless light and heat. Sure enough, at this moment, his ball was already enveloped by a grayish existence. It was precisely that hazy existence that blocked the light and heat emitted by the ball, as well as greatly weakened the connection between him and the ball. At this moment, a figure condensed above the ball out of thin air. It was as if there was a brush directly sketching it out. This figure was none other than Luo Fan. He looked no different from the Luo Fan who had just appeared. It was impossible to tell that he had died once before. How is this possible? Seeing Luo Fan, even though the dark red-faced cultivator had already guessed that Luo Fan was not dead, he was still in disbelief. One must know that although he had not yet sent the light of heaven and earth into the chaotic state, he had already enveloped the light of heaven and earth with his mysterious power. Under such circumstances, the other party had used the light of heaven and earth to come back to life. How could it not appear in his power? How could it appear in his divine ability? Although your means are quite brilliant, your foundation is still lacking. Luo Fan smiled faintly at this moment. In fact, from the beginning of the battle with the dark red-faced cultivator, he was at a disadvantage in terms of means. During the battle, the other party could continuously use all kinds of means that he could not deal with, and he could only comprehend the means through the other party's means in order to obtain the means to fight him. It went without saying how great the advantage it had was. If the other party had the light of heaven and earth comparable to his, Luo Fan would not have been so relaxed at this time. However, it was a pity that although he had stepped into the 7th level of the road to Tao Master, the cultivation of the opponent in front of him at the 5th and 6th levels was obviously far from enough. At least, it was far from enough for Luo Fan. This made it so that even though his methods were sufficiently brilliant, the results were nothing to write home about. Just like at this moment, the ball that Luo Fan had wrapped with the help of the gray existence. If it could really exert its potential, it might have completely cut off the communication between Luo Fan's reality and other realms. If that was the case, his immortality might disappear, and death would be death. But what about now? Under the lack of a foundation, although the ball could affect the communication between his reality and other realms, it was only a slight influence. In the end, they were still connected together. His undying nature was not greatly affected in the end. In addition, the method that the cultivator was using to send his light of heaven and earth into the chaotic state was not effective because of the same reason. If his foundation was comparable to Luo Fan's, then the strength of his power would be countless times stronger than it was now. His speed would also be countless times stronger than it was now. In that case, perhaps when Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth was sent into the chaotic state, Luo Fan might not have time to resurrect in this reality. Chapter 25:36. At the end of the day, it was because this cultivator was far inferior to Luo Fan in terms of nurturing the light of heaven and earth on the 5th level, which resulted in this outcome. At this moment, Luo Fan did not move at all, but his light of heaven and earth had already disappeared without a trace in a flash, causing the power released by the cultivator with a dark red face to miss. With a soft poof, the ball of power directly rushed into the gray state of chaos. The hole that was broken completely disappeared at this moment, as if it had never been there in the first place. In a trance, whether it was Luo Fan or the cultivator with a dark red face, their memories of the ball of power gradually became blurry. Evidently, all traces of the ball of power had been gradually erased by the state of chaos, including the traces left in the cultivator's heart. As for why the ball of power suddenly rushed into the state of chaos, the reason was even simpler. Originally, the ball of power wrapped around Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth, wanting to send the light of heaven and earth into the state of chaos. Due to the light of heaven and earth instinctively resisting this result, it had quite a bit of resistance, resisting the power and sending it into the state of chaos. As a result, the two were in a stalemate. Under such circumstances, the light of heaven and earth suddenly disappeared, and the resistance that prevented the power from rushing into the state of chaos naturally disappeared. The final outcome was like this. Before the cultivator could react, the power had already rushed into the state of chaos, and there was no turning back. The cultivator with a dark red face had a look of pity on his face at this moment. Evidently, the disappearance of the power was a considerable loss to him. However, it was just a pity. At this moment, he clearly did not have any time to feel sad about the loss of the power that he had released. At this moment, the situation between him and Luo Fan had already reversed. Now, the one who was at a disadvantage was no longer Luo Fan, but him. In this case, to him, the most important thing now was obviously to resist Luo Fan's attack. At this moment, because the sphere was covered by the grayish presence, the impact it produced naturally disappeared without a trace. This area that was originally sealed off began to gradually collapse during this process. Gradually, it returned to the appearance of the normal forbidden area on the outside, which was filled with endless, intense light similar to the light of heaven and earth. What happened to He Xian? At this time, an anxious voice sounded. Luo Fan and the dark red-faced cultivator looked over and discovered that Jiayu Fairy, who had previously turned into pieces of flesh and blood, had completely recovered after this period of time. At this moment, her expression was rather anxious, and her appearance had completely reverted to that of a young girl. There was no longer any sense of maturity. Clearly, after knowing that something might have happened to her husband, she had long thrown everything related to her son to the back of her mind. Right now, her thoughts were completely focused on her husband, her lover. Naturally, her mentality had returned to the state of a young girl. However, whether it was Luo Fan or the dark red-faced cultivator, they did not show any surprise or curiosity towards the change in her appearance. They looked at her as if they were looking at an ordinary cultivator and did not care about the change in her appearance at all. The reason for this was naturally because this kind of change in her appearance could not be any more normal. They had seen it too many times. How could they be surprised by something they had seen so many times? At this moment, Luo Fan looked at the dark red-faced cultivator, wanting to hear his answer. The so-called Xian was obviously Jia Yu Fairy's husband, and the enemy in front of him was obviously also his enemy. Now, this person was actually able to appear here. Furthermore, he was able to disregard everything and descend to the 5th level due to the rage in his heart. Clearly, he should not have any worries in the 7th level. At least his enemy should not have any thoughts of caring about him. And this, either his enemy had already been dealt with by him, or his enemy was seriously injured and could not resist him at all. Finally, his enemy was separated from him. No matter what he did, his enemy could not do anything to him. Only these kinds of possibilities could cause such a situation to occur. Hearing this, the dark red-faced cultivator sneered and said, "He is your husband, not my husband." Hearing this, Jiayu Fairy's expression changed even more. Her body trembled, and a huge aura began to be released from her body. Suddenly, in the void, there seemed to be an incomparably vast existence extending its tentacles from somewhere, as if it wanted to extend towards this position. "What are you trying to do?" The dark red-faced cultivator cried out in shock. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression also seemed to change slightly. He did not expect Jiayu Fairy to be so reckless. At this moment, He could clearly feel that Fairy Jiayu wanted to draw the power of the Tao Master's prison over. She wanted to be dragged into the Tao Master's prison together with the dark red-faced cultivator and die together with him. You will also be suppressed like this, the dark red-faced cultivator exclaimed. It seems that this avatar is very important to him. At this moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. One must know that the dark red-faced cultivator here was only an avatar and not his real body. Under such circumstances, it should not be a big problem for this avatar to be suppressed. At most, he would just lose some of his mind. However, if that was really the case, why was this cultivator so nervous at this time? One must know that Jiayu Fairy did not come here with an avatar, but with her real body. Using her real body to perish together with this avatar, for the dark red-faced cultivator, it should be a good deal. Come, let's go in together. As Fairy Jiayu spoke, an indescribable determination appeared on her face. It was as if she had already given up on life and death. Facing her like this, the cultivator with a dark red face shouted, "Are you really willing to die together with my clone with your real body? Also, do you not want your son anymore? Are you going to give up on him completely?" Hearing this, Jiayu Fairy showed a hesitant expression. Seeing that his words were effective, the red-faced cultivator hurriedly shouted, "You went through so much trouble to send him here. Didn't you want to spend more time with your son? Didn't you want to make progress together and achieve the Tao together? Now that you perish together with my avatar, doesn't that make all your efforts go to waste? You have to think carefully." Jiayu Fairy's tears instantly flowed down. No matter what level a cultivator reached, they still had their own sense of self and feelings. If a cultivator did not care about anything and was not moved by any changes, then they would not react to anything. If they did not react to anything, then it could only mean that they did not reach the point where their emotions would appear. It did not mean that they did not care about anything, nor did they react to anything. It was clear that to Fairy Jiayu, her husband and her son were her focal points. As long as this point was touched, it would be difficult for her to calm down and maintain her composure. Along with the hesitation in her heart, the aura that she released in all directions without any scruples began to gradually retract. At this moment, the boundless existence's tentacles gradually retracted. Unknowingly, everything had returned to normal, and it seemed like nothing had happened. At this time, the dark red-faced cultivator finally relaxed a little. At this time, he was clearly quite regretful. If he had known that Jiayu Fairy was so difficult to control, why would he have provoked her like this? In other words, if he had known that Jiayu Fairy had such an incredible existence like Luo Fan by her side, why would he have appeared here? At this time, the anger and humiliation caused by Luo Fan destroying his aura avatar had already disappeared without a trace. Now, all he could think about was how to escape safely. If Luo Fan was just an ordinary fifth tribulation cultivator, whose strength corresponded to his level, then having his aura avatar destroyed would definitely make him hysterical and feel that he had suffered an unimaginable humiliation. However, right now, Luo Fan had already displayed a sufficiently powerful strength in front of him, to the point that he was unable to deal with him. Being defeated by Luo Fan was no longer considered a humiliation. What happened to Hixien? Jiayu Fairy asked with tears streaming down her face. This kind of weak appearance made the cultivator with the dark red face look down on him. However, with the threat of mutual destruction, even if he looked down on her, he did not dare to humiliate her like before. At this time, he sneered and said, "Don't worry, that puppy Hixien isn't dead. He just got lucky and entered a place of opportunity. He won't be able to come out for a while." Hearing this, Jiayu felt her body and mind relax, as if the heavy burden on her body had been lifted in an instant. "It's good that he's fine, it's good that he's fine," she murmured. The dark red-faced cultivator finally could not help but say, "Do you think entering the place of opportunity will be fine? That place of opportunity is a place of death. Out of 10 people who enter, it would be considered very safe if one could come out safely. You'd better think about how to bury his corpse." His words did not cause Fairy Jiayu to have the hysterical reaction that he had expected. On the contrary, Jiayu Fairy said without hesitation, "Hixien will definitely come out. As long as someone can come out, he will definitely be fine. Her words were resolute and had an indescribable influence. It made people who heard it feel that it was the truth, and that it was the truth. It could be said that this was no longer confidence, but faith. Hearing this, the dark red-faced cultivator was speechless for a moment. How could such a blind belief appear in a sixth tribulation powerhouse? This had completely subverted his worldview. It made him feel as if he wasn't talking to a sixth tribulation powerhouse, but an ordinary, ignorant mortal. Well, you've finished talking. Now, is it time to talk about us? Luo Fan interrupted at this time. At this time, with a soft poof, the ball that was wrapped by the gray existence suddenly collapsed, directly turned into nothingness, and disappeared without a trace. At this time, the endless roots had already spread around, completely locking the endless light around, and were about to press down in front of the dark red-faced cultivator. The cultivator frowned slightly at this time. He could not understand why Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth could be so powerful. He had experienced the 5th level before, so he naturally knew about the cultivation of the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. At that time, he had spent billions of years to refine his light of heaven and earth to a certain level of perfection, so that he could ascend, leave the 5th level, and step onto the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. During this process, he believed that he had completely mastered the light of heaven and earth, and had obtained all the opportunities that could be obtained in the 5th level. However, in the end, his light of heaven and earth was still less than a billionth of the light of heaven and earth of the cultivator in front of him. The two felt like a candle compared to the sun. The gap was so huge that he could not understand it at all. He could not imagine how the light of heaven and earth could grow to such a level. Fellow Taoist, why are you being so overbearing? At this time, the dark red-faced cultivator looked at the surrounding roots, suppressing his anger on his face, and said, I'm aggressive? Fellow Taoist, have you forgotten that you killed me twice just now? Luo Fan just faintly smiled. At this moment, the gray existence that had crushed the ball had already begun to surge on his body, like a surging wave. The boundless light in the surroundings seemed to have turned into tofu in the face of this dusky existence. It was easily minced and devoured, causing vacuum to appear wherever the dusky existence passed. It was as if it was some kind of strange beast that was constantly devouring everything in the surroundings, devouring everything in the forbidden area. The dark red cultivator sensed an unimaginable danger from the grayish existence. Although this danger was not comparable to directly facing the state of chaos, it was more intense and terrifying than any danger he had encountered before. In the face of such danger, his heart constantly trembled. If it was not for his strong self-control, he might have shown a look of fear at this time. Chapter 25:37. For those who had yet to become a true saint, everything they knew came from the state of chaos. Whether it was the perfect heaven and earth, the great heaven and earth, the true saint path, or the layers of the state of chaos, or even the true saint and everything that came from the true saint, they all came from a state of chaos. The only difference was that they were directly born from the state of chaos, or formed through various changes and evolutions. All of this naturally included living beings, including the light of heaven and earth, including all the divine abilities, all the power, all the means, and all the mysteries of the 6th, 7th, and even the 8th and 9th layers of the Tao Master Path. Therefore, for cultivators, all power, all means, and all the means would inevitably return to the state of chaos in the end. In other words, compared to the light of heaven and earth that could give rise to all changes, all divine abilities, all the powers, and all the means, the state of chaos was more original, more malleable, and more powerful. Condensing the light of heaven and earth could allow cultivators to obtain something that had almost all the power of heaven and earth. It would then allow the cultivator's strength to be improved unimaginably, and in the end, the cultivator's essence would be greatly sublimated. In fact, the various abilities, characteristics, and styles possessed by the cultivators on the 5th, 6th, and 7th levels of the Tao Master's Path could be said to be rooted in the light of heaven and earth, rooted in this incomparably mysterious foundation. Even the light of heaven and earth was like this. In that case, if there was a day when a cultivator could refine the primal chaos state and control the primal chaos state, the power, strength, and essence of the cultivator would be enhanced, and so on and so forth. It went without saying to what extent it would be enhanced. According to the understanding of the cultivator with a dark red face, such an existence could only be described as a Tao master. And at this moment, in front of the cultivator, in the gray existence that had erased his means, the cultivator faintly felt the aura of the state of chaos that he was extremely familiar with. Although this aura was still incomparably far from the true state of chaos that he had felt before. However, after all, there was already a trace of the true state of chaos. It was not the aura of chaos produced by the extreme chaos, but the aura of chaos that came from the boundless state of chaos outside the path of Tao Master. For this cultivator who had already reached the 7th floor, it was impossible for him to distinguish whether it was a rough approach or a true chaotic aura. This cultivator had indeed seen quite a few simulated primal chaos states. Even before he stepped onto the path of Tao Master, he had seen it before. He even suspected that some of them were in the true state of chaos. The countless changes that occurred were exactly the same as the changes that occurred in the true state of chaos, making it difficult for him to distinguish them from the true state of chaos. However, that was only in the past. When his cultivation realm improved, when his knowledge grew, when his perspective expanded, when he saw the true state of chaos, when he truly sensed and understood the state of chaos, he would find that the difference between the simulated state of chaos and the true state of chaos was not even as great as the difference between heaven and earth. In his eyes, all the simulations that he had seen in the past, even the ones that were closest to the state of primal chaos, only had a millionth of a similarity in color. Apart from this, everything else was shoddy, and it was difficult to find the correct parts. Even though he had reached the 7th floor of the path of Tao Master and had seen countless existences with talent and strength that were much stronger than him, this fact did not change. He had not seen a reliable simulated state of chaos. Until now, just now, when Luo Fan relied on the gray mist to seal the ball he released, he only felt that it was just a crude, inferior simulation that only had a millionth of the similarity in color. He did not take it seriously at all and did not feel that there was any essential difference between it and the state of chaos that he had seen before. But now, when the grayish existence truly displayed its might and its aura was truly sensed by him, he suddenly discovered something that he had overlooked earlier. There was a trace of real chaotic aura on this gray mist that had not been polluted by any other power and had not been deformed. This aura surpassed any simulation of the state of chaos that he had seen before and even exceeded the limits of his imagination. Feeling this aura, he felt as if he had felt the true state of chaos. Even though this aura was billions of times weaker and blurry compared to the aura of the true chaotic state, it was still constantly changing. It would only occasionally appear for a very, very short period of time before such an aura existed. But, after all, it was the aura of the true state of chaos. Compared to all the simulated states of chaos that he had experienced in the past, this was the difference between 1 and 0. This difference allowed Luo Fan to finally recognize the grayish existence in front of him as a simulation of the primal chaos. It was no longer like the so-called simulation of the primal chaos that he had seen before, which was just a clown's act of drawing a tiger, but failing to achieve anything. The difference between 1 and 0 seemed to be only a number. But that was the difference between existence and non-existence. It was already the two extremes. One could be strengthened through refinement and cultivation, and it had the possibility of becoming infinite in the end. Even if the hope was extremely slim and the possibility was extremely low, it was still so, but obviously 0 was different. No matter how much one refined and cultivated, 0 was still 0, and it could never become infinite. If it was placed on Luo Fan's body, the trace of insignificant primal chaos aura that he was currently simulating would be like one. If his methods were high enough, he would be able to extract the bits and pieces of aura that truly belong to the primal chaos state, then nurture and strengthen it until it completely replaced all of the aura in the primal chaos state. In that case, although this gray mist could not become the true state of chaos in terms of aura, it would definitely have the characteristics of the state of chaos. As long as it had the characteristics of the state of chaos in any aspect, it would be enough for Luo Fan to obtain an unimaginable sublimation, and even achieve an achievement similar to that of a true sage did not seem to be something unbelievable. In contrast, other simulated states of chaos did not have such an effect. Without the trace of the true aura of chaos, other simulated states of chaos, no matter how pure they were, and no matter how much they were extracted, it was impossible to extract a seed that could be cultivated. Without such a seed, it was naturally impossible to transform into the true aura of chaos in the end. This was the difference between 1 and 0. This was also the wonder of the gray mist that Luo Fan displayed now, and also the source of the shock of the practitioner with a dark red face. At this time, his heart was filled with indescribable shock. He looked at Luo Fan as if he was looking at a monster that he had seen for the first time. There was no such emotion as greed in his heart. The true aura of chaos was indeed extremely incredible, and being able to condense it was to make the impossible possible. However, it was just the process of condensing this aura, and it did not mean how precious this aura was. After all, for existences at their level, as long as their perception broke through the road of Town Master and broke through the heaven and earth, they would naturally be able to see the state of chaos. If that was the case, the aura of the primal chaos state would be so strong that it would explode his perception. Why would he need to pay attention to the insignificant aura that belonged to the true primal chaos state that Luo Fan had condensed? How on earth did he do it? How could such a thing happen? At this time, the mind of the practitioner with a dark red face was extremely chaotic. Countless thoughts, doubts, and possibilities kept emerging from the bottom of his heart, making him restless. He could not wait to immediately open up Luo Fan's mind and dig out all of his thoughts and thoughts. At this time, Luo Fan did not pay much attention to the simulated state of chaos that he had condensed. Compared to the practitioner with a dark red face, Luo Fan had not stepped into the 7th level of the road of Town Master, and he had not even stepped into the 6th level. However, in this aspect, he was far more knowledgeable than the practitioner with a dark red face. For the cultivator with a dark red complexion, the simulated chaotic state he had seen before was just like that. It could be said to be selling dog meat on a sheep's head. Apart from the color being 1/billionth similar, there was nothing similar at all. For him, the situation was completely different. He had seen countless simulated states of chaos. The simulation of the primal chaos had already appeared more than once in the 6 great tribulations that he had undergone, not to mention the great tribulations that he had witnessed in the billions and trillions of worlds. There were also many that simulated the primal chaos. All of these were condensed by practitioners, and there were very few of them. Almost most of them were condensed by the world, the major tribulations or the major tribulations. And all of these, in the final analysis, were derived from the real state of chaos. In this way, the aura in the state of chaos was almost the aura of the real state of chaos. Even if the aura of the simulated state of chaos was much weaker than the real state of chaos, the difference in essence would not be too great. Compared to the simulated state of chaos that was constructed by existences like the major tribulations and the major tribulations, at this moment, the state of chaos that Luo Fan thought that he had simulated was just that. Compared to the simulated state of chaos, the aura in it was tens of thousands of times weaker. In this case, it was already very shameless of him not to feel ashamed. How would he dare to have any feelings of arrogance? At this moment, Luo Fan did not feel too much sympathy for the shock shown by the dark red practitioner. He just calmly dispersed the gray existence, and his body became clear again as if nothing had happened. His actions caused the dark red-faced cultivator to reveal a look of disbelief. "What did you do? You actually dispelled such a perfect simulation. Don't you know that you may not be able to make a simulation of the same level again?" He roared angrily, and there was a painful expression on his face as if his flesh was being cut. It did not feel like Luo Fan dispersed his technique, but like Luo Fan destroyed his treasure. This kind of behavior made Luo Fan confused, and he said, "What does it have to do with you if I disperse my means?" Reckless waste of God's gift. Reckless waste of God's gift. Why did this kind of simulation appear on you? The dark red practitioner almost beat his chest and stamped his feet as if his parents had died. At this time, Luo Fan reacted slightly and said, "So that's how it is." As he spoke, he pointed with his finger. In an instant, an invisible existence emitted from the endless roots of the world and quickly gathered in the direction he pointed. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a gray existence that emitted a chaotic aura in front of him. A small, simulated state of chaos. The aura emitted by this simulated state of chaos was even purer than before. The aura that belonged to the true state of chaos seemed to be more stable than before, and the proportion of it seemed to have increased. Looking at this simulated state of chaos and feeling the aura within it, the dark red practitioner's expression became dull. He had previously comforted himself by saying that Luo Fan might have been lucky and had coincidentally condensed the simulated chaotic state. However, at this time, the other party was so relaxed and casually pointing out the simulated chaotic state that had the aura of the real chaotic state. How could his self-deception still be established? At this time, he could only admit that the cultivator in front of him was indeed countless times stronger than him. He could really condense the aura of the true state of chaos with his own ability. How could he, who had always been extremely proud, accept this? Chapter 25:38. This area had already been sealed by the countless roots extended by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. In such an area, all the changes made by Luo Fan's opponent had been erased. Under such circumstances, the red-faced cultivator could only use his own power, his own might. At this moment, he rushed straight towards Luo Fan. All the changes that he had triggered were condensed within his body. This made his body look like a huge bomb that was ready to explode at any time and blow Luo Fan into pieces. At this moment, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. In fact, he didn't even see any movement, but the chaotic state that he had just pointed out had already revolved slightly, and the crimson cultivator had already been enveloped in a gray, murky presence. As the simulated chaotic state wrapped around him, the cultivator with a dark red complexion reacted that Luo Fan's attack had already begun. At this moment, he felt as if he had really fallen into a state of chaos. Unimaginable corrosive power and assimilation power were constantly surging towards him. The terrifying power that he had been accumulating and ready to detonate at any moment had completely lost its momentum. It was as if there was a water pump frantically extracting the power from it and fusing it with the surrounding dusky existence. Sensing these changes, the dark red cultivator became even more displeased. Even this power felt a little chaotic. This meant that the simulated chaos was more similar to the chaotic state than what he had imagined it to be. This also meant that the Luo Fan in front of him was stronger than he had imagined. At that moment, the cultivator with a dark red complexion stopped circulating his power and turned to defend himself. He did his best to conceal everything about himself so that he wouldn't lose everything to the gray existence. In the end, he would be completely assimilated by the gray existence around him. As he did this, the feeling of his body being sucked and sucked away slowly subsided. Although the gray existence around him had the characteristics of the chaos state, it was after all just a simulated chaos state and not a true chaos state. Naturally, it was impossible for it to have the characteristics of the chaos state that could not be resisted unless one was a true sage. Previously, the red-faced cultivator was agitated, and he lacked control over his own power, and even his body. Facing this chaotic state that suddenly appeared, he naturally found it difficult to bear. In the end, his power, and body were quickly being absorbed by the gray existence around him. However, now that he had regained his composure and regained control over his body, his performance was naturally much better than before. Although it was not to the extent that the simulated chaos state around him would immediately be rendered useless, he could still barely defend himself. Of course, this was only for a certain period of time. Although the rate at which he was being extracted had slowed down significantly, he was still constantly losing a part of himself. As long as he had enough time, this grayish chaotic simulation would eventually be able to completely eliminate this dark red cultivator. Fellow Taoist, you almost ruined my plan just now. This time, I can't let you go so easily. Luo Fan looked at the cultivator who was wrapped by the gray existence and said. The plan he was talking about was, of course, the continent of the tall tower. These days, his cultivation focus was on the continent of the tall tower. Whether it was through the continent of the tall tower to understand the mysteries of the Tao Lord's path, to experience the profound mysteries of the final land of opportunity through it, or to use the qualifications to enter the continent of the tall tower, to exchange for what he wanted with other cultivators. All of these required the existence of the continent of the tall tower. Before this cultivator with a dark red complexion had almost destroyed the pagoda continent that Luo Fan had constructed, completely wiping out all the living beings within it, and completely cutting off the passage leading to the final place of fortune. This was clearly unforgivable for him. As for killing him twice, relatively speaking, it wasn't a big deal. After all, with the immortality he had now, it was impossible to kill him without means that could cover all levels at the same time. Any method of killing him would only bring him sufficient comprehension in the end, broadening his horizons and increasing the knowledge he grasped. That was the only use of it. In this way, he naturally didn't care much about the others killing him, of course. After all, he killed him. If he could return the favor, he would naturally not be polite. This time, I misjudged your strength, fellow Taoist. I am willing to compensate you. The cultivator with a dark red complexion said. Compensation? Luo Fan asked doubtfully. That is right. I know the location of the place of fortune that the puppy, Xian, entered. I also know how to enter it. I can tell you this secret in exchange for your forgiveness, the dark red-faced cultivator suddenly said. That's right. His behavior seemed too cowardly, but in fact, it could not be more normal. After all, even though he wasn't dead yet, it was only temporary. He could not avoid the gray simulation of chaos that surrounded him at all. Even he had no way of completely isolating the terrifying power that was being extracted from it. Under such circumstances, he could already be regarded as a fish on the chopping board. As long as Luo Fan was willing, he could definitely torture him to death and completely destroy his clone. The dark-faced cultivator did not want to lose such an important avatar. Naturally, he could only seek Luo Fan's forgiveness. Moreover, the location of the land of opportunity and the way to enter were extremely valuable to cultivators who did not know about it. But to those who already knew about it, it was nothing. After all, even if he told this secret to others, he would not forget it. He would not lose the right to enter the land of opportunity just because he told this to others. In this way, he could be forgiven by the other party, and he would not suffer any losses, so why would he reject it? As for losing face, could it be that if Luo Fan erased this doppelganger, would he still be able to keep his face? Only when he was alive would he have face. If he was dead, what was the point of having face? Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head indifferently and said, I'm not interested in this. The entrance must be on the 7th floor, right? I'm still quite far away from the 7th floor. To confirm whether your compensation is real or not, I'm afraid I'll have to wait for countless years. In comparison, I'd rather vent my anger now. The cultivator hurriedly said, No, that location is not on the 7th floor. For cultivators of any level, the distance is the same. As long as you know the way, even if you're only on the 5th floor, you can still enter and obtain endless benefits. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "Don't tell me you're talking about participating in the land of opportunity constructed by the 18 Great Worlds?" The cultivator was slightly stunned. When he saw the impatient look on Luo Fan's face, he hurriedly shook his head and said, "Of course not. Although the opportunities in that location are also extremely precious, compared to the land of opportunity I'm talking about, it's nothing." At this time, Luo Fan couldn't help but be a little curious. The land of opportunity constructed by the 18 Great Worlds must contain incredible opportunities. If one entered it, one would definitely obtain incredible benefits. Even if he didn't enter it himself, he could already roughly guess this. But at this time, this cultivator actually said that there was an even more incredible land of opportunity with even more precious benefits to be obtained. How could he not be curious? As for whether this cultivator was lying or not, there was naturally no need to doubt this at this time. In any case, if the other party couldn't take it out, then it was naturally a lie. If he took it out, then it was naturally true. If the other party lied, then he would just have to attack again and get rid of him. For Luo Fan, this was not a difficult thing. At least for now, it was not a difficult thing. Luo Fan stood there quietly and just said, "Tell me what's going on. If it's true, there's still room for discussion." Hearing this, the cultivator with a dark red face hurriedly said, "Although the land of opportunity constructed by the 18 Great Worlds also has endless benefits, after all, it is only the 18 Great Worlds. In fact, I'm talking about a land of opportunity constructed by the Tao Masters of the 3,650 Great Worlds. It is said that it is even more magnificent and vast than the Tao Master's Path. In the upper levels, although many cultivators entered and never came back, they didn't really die in there. It's possible that they directly cultivated in there." What? So many people entered and never came back? At this time, Jiayu Fairy, who was listening at the side, suddenly changed her expression and shouted. The cultivator with a dark red face completely ignored this Jiayu Fairy. Right now, the person he couldn't win against was Luo Fan, not Jiayu Fairy. Moreover, Jiayu Fairy was the wife of his enemy. In such a situation, how could he care about Jiayu Fairy's doubts? He was too lazy to pay attention to her. Hearing this, Luo Fan just asked, "That he's Xian. Did he enter the land of opportunity you're talking about?" The cultivator with a dark red face nodded and said, "Yes. I don't know why, but he, who said that he would only enter that place of opportunity when he couldn't make any more progress, actually entered that place not long ago. Perhaps he felt that he could no longer make any progress. It must be because of me. It must be because of me." Jiayu Fairy's face was full of regret when she heard this, and she murmured. At this time, Luo Fan thought about a lot of things. All kinds of possibilities kept circling in his mind. The various possible intentions of He Xian kept emerging, but they were quickly destroyed. In the end, he admitted that He Xian might really be because of Jiayu Fairy, or more specifically, because of his son and wife. Although he didn't know what the situation inside the land of opportunity was. But from the description of the cultivator with a dark red face just now, that land of opportunity was probably quite extraordinary. It could be entered at any level of the Tao Master's Path. In that case, there might be some ways to enter any level of the Tao Master's Path. Judging from He Xian's previous performance, he was probably extremely worried about his wife and son, and wanted to find a way to directly enter the 5th level through that land of opportunity to protect his wife and son. Of course, this was only Luo Fan's inference on the basis of the information he currently knew. Whether it was true, whether there was any other intention, or whether it was just because of some accident, this was not something he could confirm. Are there many of these places of opportunity on the upper levels? Luo Fan did not continue to dwell on He Xian's question, and instead directly changed the topic. Hearing this, the cultivator with a dark red face shook his head, then nodded and said, "Not too many, but not too few either. As far as I know, there are over 100 of these places of opportunity on the 7th level. Any one of them is quite precious. There are over 100 on the 7th level." Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. This number had already exceeded his imagination. When he had obtained the method to enter the land of opportunity formed by the 18 great worlds from Jiayu Fairy, he had thought that even if it was not the only one, it should be one of the few. However, he did not expect that in the upper levels, there were actually hundreds of such places of opportunity. And this was only what the cultivator with a dark red face knew. How much more did he not know? Even if he added up what he knew and what he did not know, it was only the 7th level. What about the 8th level? And what about the 9th level? Could it be that the places of opportunity could not compare to the ones on the 7th level? It seems that the true sages of the Tao Master Great World have a wide circle of friends. At that moment, he could only sigh inwardly. Such places of opportunity were obviously the product of the cooperation of many great worlds. And what kind of existence represented the great worlds? Of course, it was only existences at the level of true sages. Therefore, with so many places of opportunity, it obviously meant that the true sages and the Tao masters of the other great worlds were on good terms. Only in this way, they were willing to cooperate with the Tao Master Great World to open up the places of opportunity. However, as long as one thought about the number of true sages in the Tao Master Great World, it did not seem strange to have such connections. With so many true sages, as long as each true sage had a true sage friend from the outer world, the number of worlds they could make friends with would be counted in the thousands, or even tens of thousands. Chapter 2540. Looking at the subtle changes in the dark red cultivator's expression, Luo Fan knew that his explanation had been accepted by the other party. In fact, his method of persuasion was not a new one. It was just breaking down the various possibilities that might be encountered in an incomparably important decision to determine the outcome in a certain aspect. Just like a recruitment advertisement in the secular world, the various possibilities that might be encountered after becoming a soldier were sorted out one by one, and the risks were divided up one by one. In the end, the final risk was reduced to a negligible level, and finally, the effect of the advertisement was achieved. Now, Luo Fan was using a similar technique. This technique was actually not very brilliant. At the very least, the dark red cultivator also knew Luo Fan's intention and what technique Luo Fan was using. However, even if it wasn't a brilliant technique, coupled with the fact that Luo Fan had control over the fate of the red-faced cultivator, this technique was extremely persuasive, causing the red-faced cultivator to fall into contemplation along with his train of thought. In other words, if it's the second and third situation, then for fellow Taoists, entering the land of opportunity can be considered as a loss that outweighs the gains. Luo Fan made up his mind. Of course, this was a little too absolute, but at this time, under this situation, the dark red cultivator agreed with this judgment. At least, if it was the second or third situation, it was not worth it for him to sacrifice such an important avatar to retain the opportunity to enter the place of opportunity. Luo Fan nodded and said, "Then, now there's only the first situation. In fact, the first situation seems to be the best, but you are restricted by some mechanism and can't reveal anything about the place of opportunity. You can't let anyone know that you have entered the place of opportunity, and it will be forever." Is this kind of ending really in line with fellow Taoists' expectations? When the dark red cultivator heard the word forever, his body trembled. At first, he didn't think too much about it. Now that he thought about it carefully, the first situation seemed to be able to remember everything and retain all the cultivation results in the place of opportunity. But was that really the best? Forever being restricted by some mechanism in terms of what he could say and what he could reveal. Wasn't this like a shackle locking him up forever? Even if the shackles only restricted the various things in the land of opportunity, shackles were shackles. For cultivators who wholeheartedly wanted to break free from all shackles and obtain eternal freedom, the existence of such shackles represented a stain on their souls, a flaw. Perhaps this kind of stain, this kind of flaw, would one day bring him unacceptable consequences. As he thought of this, he suddenly felt that the method to enter the land of opportunity was actually a shackle. It was clearly his own memory, so why would it be erased once he revealed it? Doesn't this mean that my memory is being manipulated by some mechanism? At this moment, he suddenly had the thought of completely abandoning this method of entering the land of opportunity. At that moment, he looked at Luo Fan and sighed. Although it wasn't a very brilliant persuasion, fellow Taoist succeeded. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "It doesn't need to be brilliant. As long as it's effective, it's fine." Isn't fellow Taoist worried about the drawbacks that fellow Taoist mentioned? The dark red cultivator asked Luo Fan. "I naturally have my own thoughts. You don't need to worry about it." Luo Fan just smiled. Hearing this, the dark red cultivator shook his head. He naturally understood that during the persuasion process, just now, Luo Fan used some verbal techniques. The drawbacks were definitely not as serious as he thought, and there were bound to be other possibilities. However, he couldn't do anything about it. Now, the existence of this drawback was deeply rooted in his heart. With this mentality, he could no longer enter the mysterious land of fortuitous encounters with peace of mind. He could no longer enjoy the fortuitous encounters brought by the land of fortuitous encounters. Therefore, even though he knew that Luo Fan used a verbal technique before, he could only follow Luo Fan's expectations and give the method to enter the land of opportunity to Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled faintly, and with a thought, a tray suddenly condensed above the simulated chaotic state. It directly appeared in front of the dark red cultivator and quietly floated there, waiting for the cultivator to place the item on the tray. The dark red cultivator shook his head and sighed. Without any hesitation, he pointed at the tray. In an instant, a ball of spiritual light rushed out of his finger and landed on the tray. This was the information about the method to enter the land of opportunity that He Xian had entered. It was also the information about the method to enter the land of opportunity that He Xian had entered. After the ball of spiritual light landed on the tray, it began to shrink and condense. In the blink of an eye, it had completely condensed into the state of a piece of spiritual jade. It quietly lay on the tray and flickered with a strange light. It gave off a feeling that it was not simple or ordinary. Shortly after, he took a deep breath and his expression became solemn. Then, as if he was carrying something that weighed hundreds of millions of tons, he slowly raised his arm and pointed at the tray. Following this, his body slowly emitted a strange brilliance. This light was extremely strange. It was gray and faintly intertwined with the surrounding simulated chaotic state. It was as if they were mixed together, making it difficult to distinguish them. Immediately afterward, all of the light began to gather toward the finger that the dark red cultivator pointed at with great difficulty. It took a dozen or so breaths of time before all of the light was gathered on the finger. Then, the light flowed along the finger and landed on the tray. As it landed, the dark red cultivator felt his body relax. An indescribable sense of relief appeared on his face. Shortly after, his eyes became slightly dazed. It was as if he was trying to trace something, but he couldn't find anything. Looking like this, it was clear that he had forgotten something that he thought he would never forget. At this moment, a soft sound came from the tray. The gray light had turned into a gray piece of spiritual jade and landed on the tray. It was placed together with the spiritual jade from before. At this moment, the tray seemed to be bearing a weight that was tens of thousands of times stronger than before, and it sank slightly. Fortunately, Luo Fan's methods were brilliant enough. Even though the tray was suddenly bearing a shocking amount of weight, it did not collapse or even shake at all. It only gave off a feeling that it had sunk slightly. "Fellow Taoist, how do you feel right now?" Luo Fan asked. He had no intention of directly looking at the two balls of information. Since the two balls of information were already in his hands, there was no way for them to escape. What was the difference between looking at it now and looking at it later? On the contrary, he was more concerned about how the dark red cultivator was feeling. Did he really forget the method to enter the land of opportunity? And what did he feel after forgetting it? Was it relaxing or disappointed? Was it an extreme desire to recall those memories? Or was it as if he had put down a heavy burden and was glad that he forgot it? Hearing this, the dark red cultivator sighed. "It's very relaxing. Although I feel like I've forgotten something important, I also feel like I've put down an unbearable responsibility." As he said that, a relieved smile appeared on his face. "I still have to thank fellow Taoist. If it weren't for you, I definitely wouldn't have made up my mind to hand over the method to enter the land of opportunity. That way, I wouldn't be able to enjoy this relaxing feeling," he said to Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but smile. "It seems that we have a win-win situation this time." "A win-win situation? I don't think so. Since fellow Taoist has accepted the method to enter the land of opportunity, you may have to bear some kind of great responsibility. This might not be a good thing for fellow Taoist," the dark red cultivator said disapprovingly. Luo Fan didn't care at all. "Responsibility? I've never been afraid of this kind of responsibility." As he spoke, he raised his hand and gently waved. The tray carrying the 2 pieces of beautiful jade of different colors and materials directly floated out of the gray and hazy state of chaos and directly arrived before him. After the tray arrived, Luo Fan didn't show any hesitation. With a wave of his hand, the 2 pieces of beautiful jade turned into light and rushed into his body. They turned into endless information and fused into his mind. The land of opportunity that was jointly created by the 3,650 large worlds naturally wasn't anything special. It was just like the method to enter the land of opportunity that he obtained before. It didn't give him any special feeling. In contrast, the information contained in the gray piece of beautiful jade was completely different. This information described a method to enter a certain land of opportunity. No matter which level of the Tao Master's path, or even outside the Tao Master's path, as long as one knew this method and followed this method, he would naturally be able to step into that special land of opportunity. Compared to the land of opportunity that was jointly created by the 3,650 large worlds, the method to enter this strange land of opportunity didn't have any necessary explanation for that land of opportunity. Therefore, even if Luo Fan now knew the method to enter the land of opportunity, he didn't know how many large worlds had jointly created the land of opportunity, or whether it was created by a true divine in a certain large world, or simply formed by itself in the state of chaos. All he knew was what the cultivator with the dark red face had told him. This method of entry must not be divulged to others. Once it was divulged to others, he would completely forget about this piece of information. He would never be able to remember it again. Faintly, there was a subtle pressure emanating from this information, constantly oppressing his mind, his soul, and even his body. What a wonderful information. Just the existence of this information is enough for me to gain a lot. Looking at this scene, such a thought suddenly emerged in Luo Fan's mind. This information might be a burden for the dark red cultivator, but for Luo Fan, it was an opportunity. It was a good opportunity for him to comprehend another kind of change in the information, another kind of mystery. As long as he could study the mystery of this information, as long as he could clearly understand why this information would have such a change and why it could bring him such pressure, he would definitely understand something. In contrast, whether to enter the land of opportunity or to fight for the opportunities in the land of opportunity was secondary. Have you heard of anyone else knowing the method to enter the land of opportunity? Luo Fan suddenly asked the dark red cultivator. Hearing this, the cultivator was slightly taken aback, and he replied, "I do know a few people who know the method to enter. It's just that there aren't many of them. Also, they all have scruples, and even after obtaining this method for billions of years, they have never tried to enter." "Oh, I see. I have another question. Where did you get this information from?" Luo Fan asked again. Once this method to enter was leaked and known by others, the person who leaked it would forget this information. Therefore, other people who obtained this information, unless they had no other choice, such as this dark red cultivator, would never give this information to others. If that was the case, then how did this person, who is obviously not special and should not be considered as powerful in the 7th level, obtain this information? Who on earth gave this information to him? Hearing this, the dark red cultivator was stunned for a while, and then he said, "I seem to have forgotten. It seems like someone gave it to me. Well, it also seems like it appeared out of thin air." As he said that, his complexion became incomparably ugly. Then, his eyes were full of sympathy for Luo Fan, and there was even a faint, inexplicable fear. After all, he was a 7 tribulation expert from the 7th level of the road to Down Master. Such an existence could be said to be a powerhouse no matter which world he was in. Even the big world where there were existences like true saints, it was the same. As an existence that could be called an expert in any world, he actually discovered that some parts of his memories had actually become blurry. At a certain crucial point, his memories had actually been erased by some sort of mechanism. In fact, he had not even felt any abnormalities all this while. How terrifying this was self-evident. And the source of this horror was obviously the information he had given to Luo Fan at this moment. In this way, at this time, he felt sympathy for Luo Fan, who had received this information. Chapter 2541. At this moment, the cultivator felt that this was the best outcome for him. Manipulating my memory from the beginning, this kind of opportunity is not something I can bear at all. With this thought in mind, his expression became calm. He looked at Luo Fan, waiting for him to fulfill his promise. Luo Fan did not have the idea of violating the previous agreement at this time. At this moment, he smiled faintly and waved his hand. The gray simulated chaos state had already released the cultivator. The cultivator pounced towards where Luo Fan was and disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. At that moment, the dark red cultivator felt an indescribable sense of relief welling up in his heart. At this moment, the intense discomfort from being enveloped by the gray simulation of chaos had completely disappeared without a trace. It was replaced by a feeling of almost omnipotence. Obviously, the suppression he suffered had completely disappeared. Now, he had regained all kinds of mysterious power that a 7 tribulation expert should have had as a 7 tribulation expert who went against the flow on the 7th floor. I've been here for a long time, and it's not good to delay any longer. Goodbye. The cultivator said directly to Luo Fan. As he spoke, he quickly disappeared as if he was escaping. In fact, for the cultivator, every minute and second he stayed on the 5th floor, since he was wrapped in the gray simulated chaos state, was a great torment for him. This torment made him want to leave the 5th floor as soon as possible and return to the 7th floor of the Down Master's path where his body was. Under such circumstances, one could imagine how anxious he would be when he had the chance to escape. As for sneak attacking Luo Fan, while he was released, the cultivator was not interested in doing such a thing. After all, the previous situation had long been clear that Luo Fan was now much stronger than him. At least, he was much stronger than his doppelganger here. His attack, even if the opponent was unprepared, would not be able to completely kill the opponent in one move. And if he couldn't kill the opponent in one move, then what awaited him would be the opponent's endless attacks. At that time, the good situation that he had now would inevitably be completely erased. In a situation where he was not sure, of course, he would not waste time and opportunity to sneak attack Luo Fan. Luo Fan naturally had no intention of stopping the dark red-faced cultivator from leaving. Since he had already decided to keep his promise and let him go, he naturally had no intention of dealing with him. In this way, whether the cultivator stayed on the 5th floor or wanted to enter the 7th floor, it did not matter to him. On the other hand, Fairy Jiayu wanted to say something but hesitated. It was as if she wanted the cultivator to stay, but she couldn't find a reason to do so. This kind of hesitation continued until the cultivator completely disappeared from the 5th floor. After a long time, Fairy Jiayu said to Luo Fan, "Can you tell me the way to enter the land of opportunity?" Then, afraid that Luo Fan would misunderstand, she said, "Don't tell me the way to enter the land of opportunity that will be forgotten if it is leaked. Instead, tell me the way to enter the land of opportunity built by the 3,650 large worlds." Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. Then, he suddenly understood what Fairy Jiayu meant. "You want to go and find your husband?" he asked. "Yes, I hope you can help me. I have another way to enter the land of opportunity here, and I can exchange it with you." Fairy Jiayu said. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled. I agree to this exchange. But are you not afraid of him anymore? Saying this, he pointed to the continent of the tall tower not far away. Seeing Luo Fan's action, Fairy Jiayu looked at the continent of the tall tower with a somewhat complicated expression. She said, Of course I won't ignore my son. I plan to wait for my son to come out and enter the land of opportunity with him to find my husband. Hearing this, Luo Fan understood what she was thinking. Thinking about it, Fairy Jiayu did not regard this as the only way to find her husband, but as the last way out. In other words, she was actually looking forward to whether she would be able to find her husband in that land of opportunity. The reason why she wanted Luo Fan to give her the way to enter the land of opportunity was to use this as the last hope to find her husband if she could not wait for her husband. In other words, her main method was to wait near the continent of the tall tower, and see if her husband could come here before her son transcended the continent of the tall tower. After all, according to He Xian's thoughts, he had clearly stepped into the land of opportunity so that he could personally witness his son leaving the continent of the tall pagoda. Under such circumstances, if everything went smoothly, He Xian would obviously come here before his son transcended the continent of the tall tower and see his son transcend the continent with his own eyes. And if He Xian did not come before that, then the result was very likely that something had happened to He Xian in the land of opportunity. In that case, the way to enter the land of opportunity would obviously be useful. Of course, this kind of thinking did not take up much of Luo Fan's thinking. Very soon, he had already pointed out a bit of spiritual light and directly sent it to Fairy Jiayu, which contained the method to enter the land of opportunity that was constructed by 3,650 large worlds. Fairy Jiayu had a somewhat complicated expression as she pointed out a bit of spiritual light and floated towards Luo Fan. That was the method to enter another land of opportunity. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan received the spiritual light, and in an instant, a large amount of information surged out, allowing him to instantly understand the method to enter a land of opportunity that was jointly opened by the three large worlds. Although the number of large worlds that had cooperated with each other, the method to enter the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained was more than 1,000 times worse than the method to enter the land of opportunity that he had paid for. However, this did not mean that the value between the two was more than 1,000 times worse. The degree of preciousness of the land of opportunity might be related to the number of large worlds that had cooperated to construct the land of opportunity, but the correlation was actually not absolute. The large worlds that had been jointly opened by 3,650 large worlds might be much larger and richer, but for cultivators, it might not be of much use, nor would it be too much. The scale of the land of opportunity that had been jointly opened by the three large worlds might be much smaller, but the use of it might be extremely rich. After all, an existence at the level of a true saint was hundreds of millions of times stronger than an existence below the true saint level. Any creation of such an existence, for an existence below the true saint level, was an existence so mysterious that it was incomprehensible. And an incomprehensible superposition, no matter how much it was obviously meaningless to an existence below the true saint level. Not to mention anything else, even the place where Luo Fan was now was only built by a true saint of the Tao Master Great World. Compared to the land of opportunity that had been jointly constructed by the three large worlds, the source was only 1/3. However, the current Luo Fan had only reached the 5th level of such a Tao Master's path. Therefore, fundamentally speaking, using the method to enter the land of opportunity that had been jointly constructed by 3,650 large worlds to exchange for the method to enter the land of opportunity that had been jointly constructed by the three large worlds was not a loss for either party. Come to think of it, I now have the method to enter the 4 lands of opportunity. Perhaps I should find a chance to choose a land of opportunity to take a look. Looking at the method to enter the land of opportunity that had been jointly constructed by the three large worlds, Luo Fan thought to himself. At this time, Jiayu Fairy had already completely received the divine light that Luo Fan had given her. However, she did not look happy because of this. Instead, her expression was rather complicated. Obviously, for her, the value of this land of opportunity was not enough to suppress her worry for her husband and her son. Luo Fan did not have any intention of staying here any longer. Seeing that Jiayu Fairy had already returned to normal, he only greeted her before his figure had already disappeared. When he reappeared, he had already returned to his cave residence in the center of the forbidden area. As he returned, the countless roots that had penetrated the entire forbidden area quickly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, they had already retracted and returned to the divine light of heaven and earth behind him, causing the entire forbidden area to return to its original appearance. It recovered. At this time, the many cultivators in the forbidden area were all extremely shocked. The battle between the dark red-faced cultivator and Luo Fan was simply too high-end. The many cultivators in the forbidden area did not feel anything about this battle at all. To them, they could only see countless roots suddenly appear in the forbidden area, causing the entire forbidden area to seem to be completely sealed during this process. Then, everything fell into silence. It was as if time and space had completely frozen. All of their senses had been sealed, and all changes had been erased. It was only now that the roots had disappeared that they regained their senses of the outside world and the various situations in the forbidden area. At this time, the cultivators were all asking around to find out what had happened. However, in the end, none of the other cultivators could sense what had happened here. Everyone, whether they were strong or weak, whether they had condensed the divine light of heaven and earth, or whether they had only condensed the embryonic form of the divine light of heaven and earth, or even those who had not yet condensed the embryonic form of the divine light of heaven and earth, had completely fallen into a state where they could not sense the outside world at all. As for what had happened before, no one could know at all. At this time, Jiayu Fairy had already hidden her figure again. In front of Luo Fan and the dark red-faced cultivator, Jiayu Fairy was nothing and could not even intervene in the battle between them. However, this did not mean that Jiayu Fairy was weak. After all, she was an expert from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. Such an existence was almost absolute for the existence of the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. If she wanted to hide, all the cultivators in the 5th level, whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or rogue cultivators, whether they had already touched the qualification to ascend or not, would never be able to find her. Even Jiayu Fairy could not be found. After exploring for a long time, those cultivators could only give up on the idea of continuing to explore. However, this change also caused many cultivators to have a grudge in their hearts. They had more concerns about the decision to stay in the forbidden area. This forbidden area was so dangerous. If they continued to stay here, a palm might fall from the sky and directly crush them to death. Due to this concern, a large number of cultivators left the forbidden area in the following period of time, causing the cultivators' settlements near the continent to become quite deserted for a period of time. Of course, this kind of desertion only lasted for a while. As more and more cultivators joined the fray, the desolation of the areas around the Spire continent was gradually broken. Even because other cultivators left, it made it easier for those cultivators to gain a foothold here. In the end, this place became more lively than before. After tens of thousands of years, the various consequences of the previous battle had completely disappeared. Everything seemed to have returned to its original state, as if nothing had happened here. Everything was still the same as before the dark red-faced cultivator appeared. After returning to his cave abode, Luo Fan did not rely on those methods to enter the land of opportunity, Although the 4 places of opportunities were extremely mysterious, they seemed to be able to bring him great benefits. However, every land of fortuitous opportunity had its own dangers. Before he had a deeper understanding of them, he did not intend to enter them. In particular, at this time, his experiment on the continent of the Tall Tower had not been completed. Even if he had figured out the situation of all the places of opportunities, he would not enter a place of opportunity at this time. As for the way to understand the various places of opportunities, it was none other than the method to enter a place of opportunity that he had obtained. Chapter 2542. For an existence that could not be explored at all, how could one detect its nature and deduce its internal structure? The only way was to look at the various characteristics that it displayed as a whole. Then, through the analysis of these characteristics, one could deduce the structure that could form these characteristics, and finally obtain the internal structure of the existence that could not be detected. Although this method would definitely cause a huge problem, and it would definitely be a huge oversight. However, it was already the best method that one could choose. For Luo Fan, the land of fortuitous opportunities that were created or constructed by the joint efforts of numerous worlds were existences that could not be detected. He obviously could not directly sense the internal structure of such an existence, the fortuitous opportunities within it, the dangers that one might encounter, the benefits that one could obtain by entering it, and whether one could come out or not. If he wanted to find out, the only thing he could do was to deduce the method to enter the land of fortuitous opportunities that he had obtained at this moment. This seemed unbelievable, but it was actually very reasonable. If the method to enter the land of fortuitous opportunities was completely out of the land of fortuitous opportunities, it would only be some ordinary actions. At most, one would have to add some strength and techniques, but it was still within the scope of ordinary actions in the end. However, after one was connected to the land of fortuitous opportunities, this seemingly ordinary action could become a way to communicate with the land of fortuitous opportunities, a way to enter the land of fortuitous opportunities, and a way to open the passage and door to the land of fortuitous opportunities. This was extremely obvious. These seemingly ordinary actions were actually able to mobilize some of the power of the land of fortuitous opportunities. In other words, these ordinary actions contained some profundities that were closely related to the land of fortuitous opportunities. Perhaps it was impossible to deduce all the profundities of a land of fortuitous opportunities through these profundities, but one would definitely gain something. Among them, the most obvious profundities were obviously the method to enter the last land of fortuitous opportunities that the cultivator with a dark red complexion had given him. Just the existence of that method alone was enough to manipulate a cultivator's memory, causing the cultivator to completely forget about it after telling others about it. If it was said that it was not closely related to the land of fortuitous opportunities and did not contain the profundities of the land of fortuitous opportunities, one would have to believe it. However, even though it was the most obvious, Luo Fan did not place it as the first target to comprehend it. What he was trying to comprehend now was the method to enter the other three places of opportunity. Although the method to enter the last land of opportunity contained more mysteries and principles, it was also because of this that the difficulty of comprehending it was much higher than the other methods to enter the other lands of opportunity. If the method to enter the other lands of opportunity was said to be as difficult as elementary school mathematics, then the difficulty of comprehending the method to enter the last lands of opportunity would be a world-class mathematics problem. The gap between the two was huge and self-evident. Obviously, although Luo Fan's cultivation realm was rather high, and his ability to experience, deduce, and comprehend had reached a height that ordinary cultivators couldn't imagine, it was obvious that Luo Fan's cultivation realm was rather high. However, it was still too hasty for him to get started with the most difficult problem. On the other hand, it would be different if he started with a method to enter the other lands of opportunity. It was equivalent to first solving elementary school mathematics problems before trying to solve the world-class mathematics problem. Although the gap was still huge, at least he had established a bit of a foundation and could slightly lower the final difficulty. These thoughts did not appear in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. In fact, all these judgments were merely his instincts. With just a slight thought, he directly chose the method that was most beneficial to him. He focused his comprehension on the other three methods of entering the land of opportunity that he possessed at this moment. The methods to enter the lands of opportunity were a little complicated and simple. However, whether it was complicated or simple, it was only on the surface. On a deeper level, the method to enter any of the lands of opportunity was 1,000 times more complicated than it seemed. No matter how complicated the method to enter the lands of opportunity seemed, the real method to enter the lands of opportunity was 1,000 times more complicated than it seemed. In order to comprehend the deeper mysteries of the methods to enter the lands of opportunity, one would obviously need to remove the surface and completely reveal the essence hidden in the depths of the surface. If I use this method to circulate my power in a certain environment, I will be able to trigger the lands of opportunity after 36 great circulations, build a passage, and step into the lands of opportunity. This was the first method that Luo Fan chose to enter the lands of opportunity. This land of opportunity was constructed by the three great worlds together. It was the method to enter the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had exchanged with Fairy Jiayu. Although the value of the lands of opportunity was not measured by the number of lands of opportunity that had cooperated with each other to create the lands of opportunity. However, for living beings, they would subconsciously feel different about the number of lands of opportunity that had cooperated with each other. They would ultimately look down on the lands of opportunity that had been created with the cooperation of a few lands of opportunity. Even Luo Fan vaguely had such a tendency in his heart. It was precisely because of this that his first choice at this moment was to comprehend the method to enter the lands of opportunity that had been created by the three lands of opportunity. Although this method of entry did not seem complicated and only required a corresponding method to circulate one's power 36 great circulations in the corresponding environment, Luo Fan was able to see the deeper mysteries and many deeper secrets within with a single glance. That environment, that method, those 36 great circulations, each of them contained extremely profound principles. It could be said that every single one of them was closely related to the nature of the lands of opportunity. Through the choices of these various factors, he could vaguely guess many things. Of course, at this moment, this kind of guess was only a guess. As for what exactly was going on, whether this kind of guess made sense, it would depend on his own deductions and careful guesses. This was not a simple matter, and its complexity was even greater than what Luo Fan had previously thought. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly. Countless pieces of information, countless thoughts, and countless possibilities appeared in his mind. They were constantly combining and evolving. The various details of the environment were constantly broken down by him, and the possible changes that might occur in those details and the combinations after those changes were constantly displayed in his mind. As for the method, every detail was broken down. Apart from the details that had been confirmed, the possible changes that might occur were also broken down by him at the same time. After that, more importantly, the 36 great circulations, as well as the power used to circulate these 36 great circulations. The 36 great circulations themselves contained extremely profound principles, and all the details of the trajectory of each great circulations clearly contained some of the mysteries of the lands of opportunity that had been created by the three lands of opportunity. Just analyzing it would be enough for him to reap great rewards. Not to mention the fact that different powers could cause different results, yet they could still communicate with that land of opportunity and open up a path to that land of opportunity. This could obviously display some of the special characteristics of that land of opportunity, and this was only the decomposition of the first layer. Next, there was still the second layer, the third layer, and the countless layers. It could be said that just these things that Luo Fan needed to comprehend were already enough for any ordinary cultivator to spend hundreds of millions of years to complete. However, this was not difficult for Luo Fan. At least, it was not too difficult. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and his expression became indifferent. An extremely subtle aura began to linger around his body, as if countless space-time had appeared out of nowhere and quickly disappeared. The process of space-time appearing and disappearing was extremely fast, so fast that even a fifth tribulation powerhouse could not clearly see the details of the entire process. They could only see that there seemed to be light and shadows rapidly appearing and disappearing around his body, making his body look blurry. As for the specifics, they could not see at all. Time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and a world appeared out of thin air in front of him. It quickly condensed and was frantically perfecting itself. The structure of this world was extremely strange. It was like an onion, with layers upon layers. Now, only the outermost layer seemed to be slightly bright. From the second layer onwards, every layer was dim and without any light as one went deeper into it. When they reached the innermost part, it was completely dark. It felt like a deep abyss. Looking at this scene, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. There was an inexplicable and complicated expression on his face. The structure of this world was the structure of the lands of opportunity that he had analyzed. Of course, this was only within the scope of what he could understand. It was a structure of a land of opportunity that was specially created to satisfy the method of entering a land of opportunity that he had obtained. There was definitely a huge difference between this kind of structure and a real land of opportunity. At the very least, it was unlikely that the lands of opportunity was just a world. However, obtaining such a structure was already his limit. After all, what he knew was only the entry method of the lands of opportunity. Moreover, in summary, the method could only be summarized in 3 sentences. Under such circumstances, it was needless to say how brilliant his methods were to be able to obtain such a general structure. Based on the information he had obtained, the lands of opportunity would definitely have many layers. Perhaps it was just like the Tao Master Path, where one could only reach the corresponding layer with corresponding strength. Apart from the many layers, there's also a layer that was specially used to guide living beings into the lands of opportunity. The structure of that place must be extremely mysterious, and it must contain some kind of existence that had condensed the essence of the great world, and so on and so forth. When all these details were combined together, it formed the general structure of this world that appeared in front of Luo Fan at this moment. As for why it was dim from the second layer onwards, it was obviously because with the information he had obtained, it was impossible for him to push himself into the second layer. Everything stopped at the first layer. Naturally, Luo Fan was not very satisfied with this kind of harvest. However, it was obvious that this was only him. If other cultivators knew that he was able to deduce so much about the situation of that place of fortune just by relying on this information, then they would surely be extremely shocked, and they would feel that they and Luo Fan didn't obtain the same method to enter the same place of fortune. This is already the limit. Looks like I can only use another method to deduce. Seeing that the world before him was finally unable to continue to be complete and finally completely collapsed and disappeared, Luo Fan could only sigh. He first set aside the results of his previous hundreds of thousands of years of speculation and took out another method of entering the lands of opportunity from the depths of his memory. The method of entering the other lands of opportunity that he had taken out was the method of entering the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 18 large worlds. Compared to the method of entering the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 3 large worlds, this method of entering the lands of opportunity was more than 100 times more complicated. Previously, the method of entering the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 3 large worlds could only be summed up in 3 sentences. But the method of entering the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 18 large worlds, no matter how one summed it up, would require at least 120 sentences to be completed among them. It even required Luo Fan to create some corresponding worlds and construct various corresponding materials too. Be able to complete this method. Compared to the method of entering the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 3 large worlds, this method of entering practically walked to the other extreme, an extreme of complexity. Carefully observing this extremely complicated method of entering the lands of opportunity, Luo Fan's heart felt much more relaxed than the previous method. Although it seemed more complicated, It was precisely because of this complexity that the information revealed within was many times more than the previous method. With the previous method as an experience, Luo Fan did not even begin to analyze it, and had already seen many of the characteristics of the lands of opportunity that were jointly constructed by the 18 large worlds at this time. Of course, these were only some of the characteristics, and he could only roughly see it. As for the specifics, whether or not his first impression was correct, he naturally had to look at it in detail afterwards to be able to determine. Chapter 2543. As Luo Fan studied the few places of opportunity, time continued to pass. Music plus literature plus novel millions of years had passed unknowingly. During these millions of years, Luo Fan had thoroughly studied the methods to enter the other places of opportunity, apart from the most special one. The reason why it took him millions of years to complete this process was very simple. However, after studying the methods to enter the land of opportunity separately, he was able to comprehend by analogy and discovered the profound meaning hidden in many details that he previously thought were meaningless. Thus, he once again studied the methods that he had already comprehended once before in depth. Due to the repetitive process, he spent several times more time than before to complete the entire research process. At this stage, it also meant that he had completed all the basic processes of studying the method to enter the last place of opportunity. In other words, he could already start to study the method to enter the place of opportunity, which he would forget as long as it was leaked to others. Compared to the previous few entry methods, the one that Luo Fan cared about the most was obviously the last method to enter the land of opportunity. After all, the other methods seemed to only involve the circulation of power, but the last method to enter the place of opportunity involved a more mysterious and profound mechanism. Compared to the previous methods, which could only allow Luo Fan to roughly see the outline of the place of opportunity, the last method obviously contained more characteristics of the place of opportunity. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally cared more about the method to enter the last place of opportunity. As he thought of this, the method to enter the place of opportunity gradually appeared in his mind. The method to enter the place of opportunity was rather complicated, although it was not as complicated as the most complicated method that he had studied in the past millions of years. However, it was definitely not something that the simplest method could compare to. Among them, there were more than 3,000 different steps. Although each step was not extremely complicated, there were a lot of details, and there were even many that Luo Fan could not understand. He even felt that it was specially prepared to create a sense of ritual. As expected, studying the other methods to enter first is the right choice, thought Luo Fan as he looked at the complicated and inexplicable method. If he had not studied the previous methods, it would have been difficult for him to find the starting point. Perhaps he would have to study for millions or even tens of millions of years before he could figure out where to start and what kind of posture he should use to study it. After studying several methods of entry previously, he felt completely different when he looked at this complicated and inexplicable method of entry. Although there were still many details that he could not figure out what exactly they were used for, he understood most of them at a glance. The various details that were originally disorderly became orderly in the blink of an eye. The existence of these orderly methods was like an extra thread in a mess. As long as he grasped these principles, it would be equivalent to grasping the key clue to solving the entire problem. As long as he followed these principles, as long as he had enough time and energy, he would eventually be able to thoroughly study the entire method of entering the spirit world. It could be said that the previous research had directly broken the biggest obstacle of the final method of entry. As his thoughts flashed, the entry method that was already extremely complicated began to expand in Luo Fan's mind. In the blink of an eye, its complexity had already increased by tens of thousands of times, and this was only a small part of the details that he could grasp. Almost 99% of the remaining details hadn't changed. They still needed to wait for Luo Fan to unfold them. It was conceivable that if all the details were revealed, the amount of information would reach an inconceivable level. However, looking at this scene, Luo Fan did not feel surprised at all. In fact, on the contrary, He felt that only such complexity could match the uniqueness of this entry method. After all, this was a kind of information that could manipulate the memories of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. If this information was extremely concise, or even just a few sentences, then Luo Fan would instead suspect whether he had left a huge oversight in his cultivation. After unfolding these details to this step, his previous accumulation had almost been used up. Later research might still be able to benefit from the previous foundation, and he could use the previous foundation to help him further research, but that already required a lot of deduction and consideration. If he wanted to know the answer at a glance, like just now, and obtain the results after the decomposition, he could not even think about it. Immediately, he slowly closed his eyes, and wisps of strange, mysterious light began to appear around his body. It seemed that there were all kinds of indescribable information constantly being revealed from his body. In a trance, there seemed to be some invisible existence coming out of nowhere, floating above his head. It was faintly discernible, sinking and floating. It seemed to want to press down, but also seemed to want to disappear, faintly revealing a somewhat hesitant posture. If a cultivator could see Luo Fan at this moment, they would see the faintly discernible existence at first glance. However, when they carefully observed, they would find that the existence had already disappeared without a trace. The feeling that there was some kind of existence above Luo Fan's head that could press down at any time seemed to be just an illusion. Luo Fan did not sense any of this. However, he clearly knew that anything that happened at this moment was actually not worth being surprised. After all, he could already be considered to have touched the method to enter that strange land of opportunity. With the wonders of that method, this touch would obviously bring about some effects. This kind of influence could appear in any form. For example, the faintly discernible, sinking and floating invisible existence above his head was just a very common phenomenon. As for whether that existence would cause irreversible consequences to Luo Fan if it really pressed down, there was no need to worry at all. After all, this kind of existence only appeared in the real world. In other worlds, this kind of existence did not appear. In this way, even if this existence completely erased everything about Luo Fan in the real world, his corresponding existences in other worlds could also support this world and completely eliminate all the consequences caused by that strange existence, whether it was Luo Fan's death in the real world or the loss of his memories. It was also because of this confidence that Luo Fan could research this method of entering without any scruples. In fact, if one were to trace back to the past, the root of the reason why he accepted this method of entering the land of opportunity so readily was because he had the support of many other worlds. Courage and pure recklessness were two different things. Even if one had enough courage and dared to face a powerful challenge, it did not mean that one would completely ignore all dangers and completely ignore the tragic consequences that might be caused by that challenge and directly accept that kind of challenge. If that was the case, it was just recklessness. Only when he was certain that he had enough confidence to face all possible misfortune would he accept the challenge. Only then would he have the courage to do so. Obviously, Luo Fan, who had the support of many worlds, accepted this challenge because he had courage and not recklessness. The research on the method of entering was not simple. Even with the many previous foundations, it was not an easy thing. Apart from the various details that could be analyzed at a glance, every step forward required a lot of energy from Luo Fan, and he even needed to conduct experiments again and again to be able to determine the deep mysteries contained within. Even when he first started to study the existence that was related to the previous clues and was easier to analyze, he still stumbled along the way. After spending tens of thousands of years, he gradually got on the right track and reduced the details that he needed to analyze from 99% to 95%. At this time, the amount of information that was unfolded from the method of entering was millions of times more than before. Even a false saint would probably feel a lot of pressure when facing such an amount of information. Perhaps some false saints that were not perfect enough might even directly suffer mental damage because of the pressure of such information. On this day, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed in the air. The endless light in front of him suddenly stirred and gradually evolved into a vast and boundless world. Immediately afterward, the scene inside this world began to change continuously, gradually turning into a strange and misty state and gradually stabilizing. At this moment, the invisible existence that had been floating above Luo Fan's head trembled slightly and suddenly descended. In the blink of an eye, it had already landed on Luo Fan's body, completely erasing all traces of his existence. At this moment, everything related to Luo Fan, including the world in front of him, began to gradually blur. The blur even included the continent of the tall tower. This was clearly the invisible existence that wanted to completely erase everything related to Luo Fan power and even the memories in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, another Luo Fan appeared out of thin air where he was originally. With his appearance, the trend of everything being erased completely stopped. It was so much so that everything, including the memories in the creature's heart, swiftly recovered. In just a few breaths' time, it had completely returned to how it was before the invisible existence descended, as if nothing had happened at all. Seems like I violated a taboo. After doing all this, Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief, and a look of realization and confusion appeared on his face. What he had done just now was to abstract the possible image of the land of opportunity from his previous comprehension. Of course, there were a lot of omissions, and there were even a lot of mistakes. If someone really treated this as the true appearance of the land of opportunity, then the losses they suffered in the land of opportunity would probably make them regret being born. However, even though there were so many omissions and mistakes, it was still an image that he had abstracted from the information that he had analyzed. There was definitely a trace of the charm that belonged to the land of opportunity. In this way, abstracting it would obviously be beneficial for Luo Fan to continue analyzing the method of entry. It was because of this consideration that Luo Fan tried to abstract the method of entry after analyzing less than 5% of the method of entry. However, it was obvious that the development of the matter exceeded his expectations. Even though he had only slightly abstracted the characteristics of the land of opportunity, the land of opportunity actually had such an intense reaction. It actually forcefully sent its power over his head and completely erased him and everything that was connected to him. This situation clearly meant that his abstraction just now had come into contact with a little bit of the foundation. This made him feel enlightened and happy. However, just this alone was enough to cause such an intense reaction. This made him feel a little confused. Fortunately, the foundation that he had prepared beforehand was sufficient. Although his body in the real world was easily erased by this power, his corresponding existences in the other worlds were not affected at all. The moment everything in his plane of reality was erased, the existences corresponding to him in many other planes naturally activated their abilities and completely restored the existences corresponding to him in this plane of reality. That kind of power seemed to only be able to be used once. After he had completely recovered, the erasure power also disappeared, allowing him to completely recover everything that had been erased from him before. This situation was obviously a wonderful thing for Luo Fan. It meant that he could continue this kind of experiment and no longer have to worry that he would be completely erased because of it. Of course, although he could continue this kind of experiment, it did not mean that he would do it immediately. After all, the abstraction just now had actually emptied out almost all of his previous comprehension. To him, trying this kind of abstraction again would be of no use other than provoking the land of opportunity. There was no other use, but he would have to bear a huge risk. How could Luo Fan possibly do such a thing? Chapter 2544. Time flew by, and before he knew it, tens of millions of years had passed. During these tens of millions of years, Luo Fan had made hundreds of abstractions of the land of opportunity. Every time he made an abstraction, he had to bear the backfire of the land of opportunity. Almost all traces of his existence in the real world had been erased. It was even to the extent that the erasure force was too great and appeared too quickly. He was almost unable to revive before it was completely erased. At that time, 90% of the existence of the Spire continent left behind by Luo Fan had been erased. If it were not for Luo Fan's resurrection at the last moment, the Spire continent might have completely disappeared. Once everything was erased before his resurrection, the Spire continent would never be able to recover, unless Luo Fan took the effort to open it up and build it himself. However, even if he was willing to take the effort to do all this, the Spire continent that he obtained would no longer be the original Spire continent. Everything in it would probably be brand new, including Fairy Jiayu's son. For such a situation, Luo Fan had already expected it. However, even though he had encountered such danger, he still carried out his original plan without any hesitation. He continued to comprehend, analyze, research, and try to visualize the land of opportunity in search of the mysteries of the land of opportunity. He did not conduct research because he was afraid of danger. This kind of thing would never happen to Luo Fan. Not to mention, the danger of this kind of research did not appear on him, but only on his creations. It was even more impossible to stop his research and analysis. No living creature on the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road knew about such a change. Even Fairy Jiayu from the 6th level was completely unaware of the existence of this danger. After all, when it was erased, everything in the living creature's memory was erased at the same time. And when it was restored, it was also restored at the same time as these memories. Therefore, the danger of those creations being completely erased did not exist for those living creatures. In other words, even though his son was in the High Spire continent, he was almost wiped out along with the High Spire continent several times. Fairy Jiayu still did not know that this process of erasure had happened before. When the Spire continent was mostly erased, Fairy Jiayu could only feel that her impression of her son had been mostly erased. At least, most of her memory of her son in the Spire continent had been erased. In this process of memory erasure, she naturally could not feel anything unusual. She did not even know that the erasure of the Spire continent would cause her great loss. However, when Luo Fan was resurrected in this reality, the erasure had completely disappeared. Everything had been completely restored. Naturally, her memory had also been restored. It was as if the previous erasure had never happened. It was completely erased of this process of her memory of the erasure of her memory. In this way, she felt even less. Therefore, even though Luo Fan had already encountered a great deal of danger over the past tens of millions of years, and there were many times when he had almost completely erased the continent of the Tall Tower, Fairy Jiayu did not care at all on this day. Luo Fan's analysis and research of the method to enter the land of opportunity had reached close to 80% completion. This kind of progress caused the amount of information that extended from the method to enter the land of opportunity in his heart to increase by tens of thousands of times compared to when he first started. At this moment, not to mention those false saints with weaker attainments, even those who were above the false saint level would probably find it difficult to withstand the impact of this information. However, at this point, he had already fallen into a bottleneck. 80%. This progress seemed to have reached a certain limit. In these hundreds of thousands of years, his efforts were no less than the previous tens of millions of years. However, in the end, he did not make any progress at all. The progress of his analysis and research did not move at all. This kind of situation made him realize that he probably needed more stimulation and more foundation before he could continue his research. Regarding this, he was naturally a little disappointed. However, even if he was disappointed, he did not stop his actions of continuing his research. After all, even if he could not continue to progress, it did not mean that his research on the method to enter the land of opportunity was useless. In fact, it was the opposite. Even if he could not progress, he could still obtain great benefits from the method to enter the land of opportunity. Whether it was the advancement of his cultivation realm, the perfection of his worldview, or the higher understanding of the Tao Lord's path, he could always obtain sufficient nutrients from this kind of research. The most obvious improvement was that in these tens of millions of years, he had only been wholeheartedly researching the method to enter the land of opportunity, but he could feel that his seventh tribulation had been brought forward by billions of years. This was obviously faster than the passage of time, which meant that his cultivation realm had made great progress. In addition, he had also made great progress in his understanding of the other land of opportunity that he had used as a foundation for research. Back then, before he started researching the method to enter the last land of opportunity, the images of the few land of opportunity that he could construct were still a little vague, and most of the areas were dim. However, now, after tens of millions of years of research, the dim areas had shrunk by more than half. Furthermore, he could even vaguely sense the method to leave some of the land of opportunity. For example, the land of opportunity that was created by the combined efforts of 3,650 great worlds, which was also the land of opportunity that Xian had entered. He had already roughly figured out the method to enter it. Of course, it was only a rough idea, and it was only a concept now. As for whether this method could succeed, whether it was effective, and how difficult it was, he could only find out after entering the land of opportunity in the future. Or perhaps he could let a cultivator in the land of opportunity give it a try. The reason why he could obtain such unbelievable gains was very simple. It was because the various land of opportunity had a certain internal similarity. This kind of internal similarity allowed one to comprehend many fortuitous lands by analogy. The profundity of the last land of opportunity that Luo Fan researched was more profound than the other land of opportunity, and the various information revealed by the method to enter it was also more than the other land of opportunity's entry method. In this way, Luo Fan was able to deduce more of the similarities in the land of opportunity. The result of this was that Luo Fan's understanding of other places of opportunity had deepened as a result of drawing parallels from other paths. Coupled with the fact that the method to enter was right in front of him, it did not seem strange for him to research the corresponding method to leave. Of course, this kind of gain was obviously only secondary to Luo Fan. To him, the focus of his research was obviously on the last land of opportunity. It was on the way to enter the land of opportunity that could affect the memory of the existence that could control the method to enter. In this process, where there did not seem to be much gain on the surface, but he could improve at every moment and gain some knowledge, time gradually came to a special point. On this day, Luo Fan's body trembled, and he suddenly raised his head from the endless and complicated information. Has it already come to this point? His eyes flickered slightly, and he stood up and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already left the center of the forbidden land that he had stayed in for tens of millions of years and arrived in front of the mainland of the tall tower. Compared to tens of millions of years ago, this mainland of the tall tower did not seem to have changed much on the surface, but the changes on the inside were already huge beyond imagination. The entire mainland of the tall tower seemed to be a completely different place from before, compared to the time distortion of about 1/3 of the mainland in the past. Now, in the mainland of the 999 floors of the tall tower, there were already 999 floors. The flow of time on the mainland was completely distorted, becoming billions of times faster than the outside world. The degree of distortion was so great that the space-time dimension where the tall tower was located seemed inexplicably strange. In Luo Fan's eyes, it seemed to have turned into countless light and shadows superimposed on each other. At this moment, Jiayu Fairy's figure appeared beside Luo Fan, looking at the tall tower in front of her with an inexplicable gaze. Compared to tens of millions of years ago, Jiayu Fairy did not change the slightest bit. For an existence like Jiayu Fairy, tens of millions of years was not much different from the blink of an eye. In the absence of any abnormal changes, of course, her image would not change because of such a time. Thank you, Taoism Peer. After Jiayu Fairy appeared here, she directly said to Luo Fan. Seeing Jiayu Fairy's grateful and determined expression, Luo Fan knew in his heart that she had probably made up her mind. It's just a deal, as long as Taoism Peer is satisfied. But, Taoism Peer, won't you think about it more? Jiayu Fairy naturally knew what Luo Fan meant, and said, "For tens of millions of years, I have thought about it clearly. My son is important, and my husband is equally important." At this moment, the tall tower continent trembled slightly, and then a stream of flowing light rushed straight out of the tall tower continent. There were dozens of these streams of light. After rushing out of the tall tower continent, they wanted to rush into the depths of the forbidden area, but after a distance from the tall tower continent, they could only stop in their tracks and recondense their bodies. It turned out that the tall tower continent was located in a forbidden area on the 5th floor of the Tao Master's Path. Here, the surrounding light was filled with a terrifying pressure. Even if it was a cultivator at the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road, if they did not have a strong enough embryonic form of heaven and earth to protect themselves, they would completely collapse under this pressure. Although these cultivators who rushed out of the tall tower continent had already transcended the tall tower continent and were qualified to cultivate on the 5th floor of the Tao Master's Path, compared to the forbidden area, they were still not strong enough. Near the tall tower continent, within the range of the tall tower continent, they were able to survive and not be harmed by the light, but that was only because of the effect of the tall tower continent itself. But once they were too far away from the tall tower continent and lost the protection of the tall tower continent, then they would have to directly bear the pressure of the endless light. This obviously was something that they could not do. Therefore, they appeared here at this time and did not dare to take a step forward. But even there, they were obviously already under a considerable amount of pressure, and at this moment, all of them looked battered and exhausted. Among the dozen cultivators who rushed out of the tall tower continent were the Tao ancestor, the former 5th senior brother, Taoist Yuan Zheng, and the one that Fairy Jiayu paid the most attention to, her son. Apart from them, there were some so-called disciples of the Tao ancestor. Looking at their appearances, they were all 5th tribulation experts at this time. Although there was a difference in the strength of each 5th tribulation expert, and the difference was not small, in essence, there was not much difference. At this time, Luo Fan looked at them, but his expression did not relax much. He carefully sensed these cultivators, and, at the same time, sensed any possible abnormalities in the surroundings. It should be known that these creatures had already transcended the tall tower continent, and their cultivation realm had also reached the level of 5th tribulation experts. But this did not mean that they would really be accepted by the Tao Master's Path immediately. At least, before they completely stabilized and the Tao Master's Path completely accepted them, he could not be sure of this. At this time, Luo Fan could faintly sense that the power of the Tao Master's prison was faintly discernible, as if it was about to descend, but also as if there was an invisible existence blocking its path, so that it could only remain in a state that was about to descend. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little anxious. This state meant that the power of the Tao Master's prison might descend, or it might not descend. In other words, this meant that the Tao Master's Path might accept them, or it might not accept them. The existence of these two possibilities for Luo Fan obviously meant that the final judgment was about to appear. Chapter 2545. The power of the Tao Lord's prison seemed to be on the verge of descending. It lingered in the illusion for a long time before it finally dissipated. Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the power of the Tao Master's purgatory dissipate. Obviously, the dissipation of the power of the Tao Master's purgatory meant that the Tao Master's Path had accepted the so-called Tao ancestor and the others. It believed that they were qualified to survive and cultivate in the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. At this time, Jiayu Fairy was inexplicably happy. She flew over and appeared in front of her son. "Mother, I did it." As soon as her son saw her, a smile appeared on his face, and he said so. "Yes, you did it. We all did it." Jiayu Fairy opened her arms and hugged her son. She looked extremely excited, and tears even fell from her eyes. This kind of performance was obviously a little too exaggerated. Her son did not think much of it at first, but soon he felt that something was wrong. Although it had been billions of trillions of years, at least to him, he still knew his mother very well. With this understanding, he immediately realized that his mother had something on her mind. Soon, he realized what was wrong. Where's father? He looked around and could not see his father. He could not help but have a vague guess in his heart. As soon as he said this, Jiayu Fairy's expression froze slightly and tears flowed down her face like a torrent. When his son saw this, he naturally understood that this matter had really happened to his father. He could not help but feel an inexplicable worry in his heart. However, after all, he was no longer a rookie who had always lived under his mother's protection. Previously, he had been tempered in the continent of the tall tower for billions of years and had already become extremely mature. At this time, he quickly put away his worries and comforted his mother. After a while, Jiayu Fairy finally calmed down. After that, her son asked her what happened to his father and why he did not appear here. At this time, Jiayu Fairy then explained to him all the various things that had happened. "Let's go find father," her son said at this time. Hearing this, Goddess Jiayu's expression froze. Only now did she realize that her son was completely different from before. Sizing up her son from head to toe, she suddenly smiled. Her eyes were filled with gratification. She nodded and said, "Yes, let's go. Who knows? Maybe we can get together sooner." Her son smiled and said, "That's right." At this moment, Luo Fan had already met up with the Dao ancestors, apart from Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother. At that moment, the Dao ancestor and the others had already greeted Luo Fan with the etiquette of juniors, expressing their boundless gratitude to Luo Fan. To them, Luo Fan was quite gentle. Although he didn't create the continent specifically for these native cultivators to transcend, no matter what, these living beings still transcended because of him. In other words, there was still some kinship between them. It was naturally an exaggeration to say that they were disciples, but it was appropriate to say that they were juniors from any perspective. Now that you've just transcended and haven't stabilized your realm, this place isn't suitable for you to stay. Next, you should first leave this forbidden area to cultivate, Luo Fan said to the Dao ancestor and the others after the etiquette was completed. Upon hearing this, the Dao ancestor's expression froze, and he asked, "Senior, may I ask if we can come back after we leave?" When they were in the Spire continent, there was never a moment when they didn't want to transcend the Spire continent and catch up to the outsiders. They wanted to possess the same strength as the outsiders and reach the same level as the outsiders. However, after transcending the continent of the tower, truly completing their own cultivation, and catching up with the outsiders, they no longer had such a strong desire to leave. After all, the continent of the tower was their home. It was where they had struggled for billions of years, and it was also the existence that gave birth to and nurtured them. Under such circumstances, how could these living beings not be reluctant to leave the continent of the tower? If they really couldn't return to the continent of the tower in the future, they would probably hesitate if they should leave this place to cultivate in other vaster worlds. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "When you can withstand this forbidden area, you'll naturally be able to return." Upon hearing this, the Dao ancestor and the others relaxed a little. However, it was only a little. Although they didn't cut off their path to return, given the terrifying pressure in the surroundings and the terrifying environment where they were about to be completely erased as soon as they approached, the difficulty of being able to withstand it and travel freely was rather shocking. In other words, if they left, whether they could return in the future and how long it would take for them to return would probably depend on their luck. However, since they could stand out among the many native cultivators and eventually become fifth tribulation powerhouses and transcend the continent of the tower, their mind were naturally quite extraordinary. Needless to say, their determination naturally went without saying. Although they didn't know how long it would take for them to return, they quickly made up their minds to leave the forbidden area and return in the future when they could withstand the pressure of the forbidden area. This kind of decision was not unexpected. Luo Fan confirmed it after seeing their decision. Then, he casually waved his hand and used his super high authority in the forbidden area to send them out of the forbidden area at the same time and into the vast and boundless fifth level of the Tao Master's path. There is also endless light outside the forbidden area, although compared to the light in the forbidden area, the light outside was much thinner and dimmer. However, it was still light with the nature of the light of heaven and earth. This kind of light was obviously filled with incredible pressure for the Tao ancestor and the others who had just left the continent of the tower. Under this pressure, the many cultivators all looked miserable, and they had no choice but to constantly release the power in their bodies to resist the surrounding light. This is the fifth level of the Tao Master's Path. It's indeed a holy land for cultivation. Even the most ordinary place hides more profound mysteries than the 998th level. The Tao ancestor felt the endless light around him and couldn't help showing an indescribable emotion on his face. Although they had transcended the continent of the tower, in fact, no one here, including the Tao ancestor, had walked through all 999 levels of the continent of the tower. In fact, they had only walked to the 998th level before they transcended the continent of the tower and appeared outside the continent of the tower. The reason for this was that they still didn't have the qualifications to step into the 999th level. After all, if they wanted to stand on the 999th level, they needed the protection of the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, just like in the boundless forbidden area outside the continent of the tower. Although these cultivators had become fifth tribulation powerhouses after going through layers of refinement in the Spire continent, they had only barely reached this level after all. They didn't have any embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, how could they have the qualifications to stand on the 999th level? In fact, the moment they broke through to the 999th level, they triggered the rules that Luo Fan had set up on the continent of the tower. They were directly transported out of the continent of the tower and transcended it. This was also the reason why Luo Fan didn't mention that there was a land of opportunity waiting for them below the continent of the tower. Because even if he had mentioned it, they wouldn't have the qualifications to attack the land of opportunity and search for the final opportunity. In this case, he would only add to their worries by telling them the news. On the contrary, if he didn't say anything, and if these cultivators didn't forget their roots, they would be qualified to come to this continent one day. They would naturally be able to come into contact with the 999th layer, and they would be qualified to search for the final land of opportunity. In this case, the rewards would naturally be great. If they forgot their roots in the future and didn't want to return, then missing this opportunity would be their own problem. It would have nothing to do with Luo Fan. Although the place where they were thrown out by Luo Fan was a very ordinary place outside the forbidden area, it was still a very strange place. However, to them, this was already a holy land for cultivation. At that moment, the Tao ancestor instructed. Then, he found a place and began to comprehend the endless light around him. He began to experience the mysteries of the light of heaven and earth. This Tao Father had become a fifth tribulation expert in the tall pagoda continent. Although his cultivation level was high enough, he was still a Tao Father. But his foundation was far less stable than that of the cultivators who ascended through the path of Tao Master. The difficulty of comprehending the boundless light that filled the surroundings was countless times more difficult than other cultivators. If even this Tao Father, who had the highest level of insight, the best talent, and the strongest comprehension ability, was in such a state, his disciples' performance was naturally even worse. In this kind of cultivation, the speed of their progress was like that of a snail, and they could only move forward little by little. Fortunately, although the tall pagoda continent that Luo Fan built was much worse than the true path of Tao Master, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan. Some of the flaws in the tall pagoda continent that he built were not completely irreparable. As long as they encountered the corresponding mysteries and obtained the corresponding comprehension, it would be a matter of course to make up for the flaws. In this way, the difficulty of consolidating and stabilizing the foundation was many times easier than that of ordinary cultivators who had taken the wrong path. Under such circumstances, the Tao ancestors' cultivation speed naturally accelerated little by little as time passed. At first, it was as slow as a snail, but after tens of thousands of years, the speed had already increased visibly. After tens of millions of years, the speed was already comparable to the cultivation speed of ordinary cultivators. However, these were matters of the future. There was no need to talk about it now. After sending the Tao ancestor and the others off, Luo Fan turned to look at Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother. "Aren't you interested in the opportunity?" Luo Fan asked directly. The Tao ancestor and the others were not qualified to step into the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent. Taoist Yuan Zheng was different from the former fifth senior brother. They were all outsiders to the tall pagoda continent. In particular, the former fifth senior brother had mastered the light of heaven and earth, which was almost complete. Naturally, it would not be a problem for him to enter the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent. However, under such circumstances, he stopped at the 999th level and did not attempt to enter it. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a wise choice. "Although this place of opportunity is rare, I want freedom more," the former fifth senior brother said faintly. Compared to before, he was much calmer in front of Luo Fan now. In other words, he had the demeanor of an expert. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and accepted his explanation. After all, he was the fifth senior brother of the previous generation. In the past, he didn't really understand what this identity could bring him. But after he found out about the existence of so many places of fortune, he understood that the identity of the fifth senior brother of the previous generation would definitely bring him a large amount of methods to enter the places of fortune. Perhaps the ways to enter the places of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained were only a fraction of what the former fifth senior brother had mastered. Under such circumstances, the place of opportunity that Luo Fan had created according to the local conditions would obviously not be in the eyes of the former fifth senior brother. "What about you? I should have released the restrictions on you by now. Why don't you choose to enter it?" Luo Fan turned to look at Taoist Yuan Zheng. After cultivating for so many trillion years, Taoist Yuan Zheng had not only become a fifth tribulation expert, but he had also unlocked all of his abilities. He had also condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth due to his comprehension of other things. Obviously, he was already qualified to step into the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent and compete for the final place of opportunity. On such a foundation, he actually disregarded everything and left the continent of the tall tower, completely giving up the land of opportunity. How could Luo Fan not be surprised by this? "My current gains are enough for me to digest for countless years. It's not a smart choice for me to pursue the final opportunity. I won't do such a thing," Taoist Yuan Zheng said with a sigh. It could be seen that he still felt a little regretful that he did not pursue that final opportunity. Chapter 2546. Looking at Taoist Yuan Zheng's decision, Luo Fan nodded to himself. From a certain point of view, Taoist Yuan Zheng could be considered as his disciple. After all, Taoist Yuan Zheng's great breakthrough this time was entirely achieved with the help of the endless mysteries and profound principles contained within the continent of the Tall Tower. These were all left behind by Luo Fan in the continent of the Tall Tower. From this point of view, Taoist Yuan Zheng could naturally be considered as Luo Fan's disciple. Of course, neither he nor Taoist Yuan Zheng would admit to this to Taoist Yuan Zheng. Although Luo Fan was brilliant, he was still at the same level as him. Moreover, Luo Fan had even used such a method to test him. Even if Taoist Yuan Zheng did not resent Luo Fan because his life was saved by Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to have much respect for Luo Fan either. Naturally, it was impossible for him to acknowledge Luo Fan as his teacher. As for Luo Fan, there was no need to even mention it. There were so many cultivators who had benefited from the continent of the Tall Tower. If Luo Fan acknowledged every one of them as his disciple, then his disciples would be counted in the hundreds of millions. Nevertheless, he had witnessed with his own eyes how Taoist Yuan Zheng, a cultivator who did not have the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, managed to condense the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth and achieve the most important breakthrough in the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path. At this time, Luo Fan still had the intention to guide Taoist Yuanzheng. Seeing that Taoist Yuanzheng had made such a wise decision, he naturally felt gratified. Then he said, "You've contributed to the perfection of the Spire continent, so you've done a good deed for the Spire continent. I'll grant you a favor. In the future, you'll have another chance to enter the continent of the Tall Tower to seek the last opportunity. No matter when, as long as you come here, you'll be able to enter the 999th floor." Hearing this, Taoist Yuanzheng was stunned for a moment. He then bowed and said, "Thank you for your help, senior." Luo Fan smiled, waved his hand, and said, "Go." This time, he did not send him out of the forbidden area. Instead, he allowed Taoist Yuanzheng to choose where he wanted to go. As for whether he wanted to stay here or leave the forbidden area to find a place to cultivate in seclusion, it all depended on himself. In any case, after condensing the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, this forbidden area was no longer an obstacle for him. It was not difficult for him to go anywhere he wanted, even if it was to open up a cave in this forbidden area and cultivate in seclusion. Taoist Yuanzheng bowed again, then took his leave. However, he did not leave the forbidden land immediately. Instead, he headed straight for the city outside the mainland of the Tall Tower. After such a long period of accumulation, the city had long become one of the few cultivators on the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign Path. It became a famous cultivation city on the 5th layer of the Tao Master's Road. The number of cultivators gathered here was not the highest among all the cultivators on the 5th layer of the Tao Master's Path, but it could be regarded as one of the best. The entire city was tens of thousands of times larger than it had been before. Even compared to the mainland of the Tall Tower, its size was not much smaller. Such a huge city appeared in the endless light of the forbidden area, like an immortal city suspended in the boundless fog. It looked ethereal and refined. Due to the efforts of a large amount of cultivators over the past tens of millions of years, this city was now similar to a magic treasure. Within this boundless light, it was constantly absorbing the power of the light into the city and turning it into power, allowing the city to maintain itself. In such a vast city, the number of cultivators could be counted in the billions. The reason why these cultivators had gathered here was naturally because of the Spire continent, because it was the final land of opportunity. However, as the city became more and more wonderful, and as the number of cultivators gathered in the city increased, the use of the city was also greatly expanded. Now, there were only a very small number of cultivators gathered in the city, and they were all here for the opportunity in the continent of the Tall Tower. Most cultivators treated this place as a place to cultivate and communicate with other cultivators. All kinds of special rules were developed here. The entire city had almost become an inseparable part of the entire 5th layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. After all, this was a forbidden area where the light was many times denser than the outside world, and the light contained endless mysteries that belonged to the light of heaven and earth. If one could cultivate safely in this place, one's cultivation speed would be at least 10 times faster than outside. In the past, the biggest reason why not many cultivators chose to cultivate here was because it was simply too dangerous. In this place where the light was incomparably dense, cultivators needed to constantly resist the endless pressure around them. If they were careless and didn't resist in time, the pressure would directly mince the cultivator, causing the cultivator to completely blend into the surrounding light. In this way, even if the cultivators who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth stepped into this forbidden area, their cultivation efficiency would only be a little higher than outside. With such efficiency, why would they take the risk to enter this forbidden area? In the 5th layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, there were quite a number of such forbidden areas. Moreover, in addition to these forbidden areas, there were also some places of opportunity that were naturally formed. These places of opportunity were fundamentally different from the places of opportunity built by true saints, but they were naturally formed by the light of the 5th layer of the Tao Sovereign Path in a different way. They were essentially similar to forbidden areas, but due to various special changes, they were not as dangerous as forbidden areas. It was because there were so many choices that the cultivators did not stay in this forbidden area for too long because of the speed of cultivation. But now, with this city, the situation was different. With this city, the cultivators no longer needed to use the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to protect themselves at all times, to ensure their own safety. In this city, even those who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth could cultivate extremely safely. They could use the light in the forbidden area, which was many times more intense than the outside world, to improve their cultivation realm and increase their understanding of the light of heaven and earth. There was no danger, but they could greatly increase their cultivation speed. This was obviously a great temptation for any cultivator. It was precisely because of this that this place had unknowingly grown to such a level and gradually became an important part of the entire fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. Of course, this did not mean that it was easy for cultivators to enter this city. In fact, after so many years of development, this city had long been set up with extremely strict rules. If one wanted to enter or stay in the city, there were all sorts of complicated rules. If one did not comply with the rules, no matter what cultivator he was, he could only be rejected by the city. Moreover, the most important thing was that this city was in the forbidden area. Although there was no danger in the city, and the intense light in the forbidden area would not pose a threat to the cultivators in the city. However, if one wanted to enter the city, they had to pass through the forbidden area. In other words, they had to take the risk of being eroded and destroyed by the endless light in the forbidden area. And this was another threshold to enter the city. Of course, compared to the various rules in the city, this threshold was relatively small. In the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, even the weakest cultivator was a fifth tribulation expert. How could such an existence be ignorant? This was a forbidden area in the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, a place where they could study at will. How could they not have researched something after such a long time? In the past tens of millions of years, the forbidden area had not become like a sieve that cultivators could freely enter and exit, but there had been hundreds and thousands of safe paths that had been researched. There were also thousands of ways for cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to enter the forbidden area and head to the city. In fact, there were many cultivators in the city that specialized in this kind of business. As a result, after tens of millions of years of development, this forbidden area looked completely different from how it used to be. Even the name of the forbidden area did not live up to its name. Instead, it looked more like the other places of opportunity that existed in the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. Such a change had caused the value of this forbidden area to undergo an earth-shattering change. If it was when Luo Fan occupied this forbidden area, it was just a dispensable place that was not valued by the cultivators on the fifth layer. Even if the Tao's sovereign disciples came out to stop it, it was only because of Luo Fan's arrogance. But now, it had become a delicious cake. Countless cultivators had their eyes fixed on this forbidden area, wanting to take it for themselves. It was only because of the attitude of the Tao Sovereign's disciples and the strength that Luo Fan had shown in the process that they had some misgivings. That was why they had not taken action, and the forbidden area was still so peaceful. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to this change. These days, he had been paying attention to the mysteries of the method to enter the final place of opportunity. At this moment, he had analyzed more than 80% of the method and had already reached a bottleneck. How to break through the bottleneck was 100 times, 1,000 times more important to him than the ownership of the forbidden area. Watching Taoist Yuan Zheng land in the city, Luo Fan turned to look at Fairy Jiayu and her son. At this moment, the mother and son had more or less come to an agreement. At this moment, there was determination in their eyes and an imposing manner that they were ready to risk everything. Looking at their behavior, Luo Fan knew their decision and sighed inwardly. At this moment, he had a thought, and in a flash, he was already in front of the two of them. "It seems that the two of you have made up your mind?" Looking at them, Luo Fan asked. Hearing this, Fairy Jiayu said, "That's right. Thank you for taking care of my son these days. It's just a deal, it's nothing. Luo Fan just declined. Then, he said, "When do you plan to leave?" Fairy Jia Yu's expression turned solemn and said, "Immediately. Every moment we wait is a moment of torture for us." Luo Fan thought for a while and said, "How about this? I have a method to leave the place of opportunity. It may be correct, or it may be overlooked. Are the two of you interested?" Method to leave. Fairy Jia Yu and her son could not help but repeat. Their words were filled with disbelief and disbelief. "That's right, this is a method that I have deduced over the years. Of course, I can't guarantee how accurate it is. However, it should be more accurate than the two fellow Taoists messing around," Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, Fairy Jia Yu hurriedly nodded and said, "If there is such a method, then it couldn't be better. Please teach me." Luo Fan nodded. Without hesitation, he pointed with his finger and a spiritual light rushed out of his hand. It condensed in the air and turned into a beautiful jade-like shape. It quietly floated before Fairy Jia Yu. This ball of light contained a method to leave the land of opportunity that Xian had entered over the past tens of millions of years, which he had deduced from the method to enter the land of opportunity. However, just like what he said to Fairy Jia Yu, the accuracy of this method was quite worrying. After all, he had never entered the place of opportunity. All the information he had about the place of opportunity came from the method to enter the place of opportunity. It could be said that this was another conjecture based on one conjecture. The accuracy would obviously be discounted by 20%. If he tried this method, he would have a 25% chance of leaving the place of opportunity safely. This could already be considered as the accuracy of Luo Fan's conjecture of the place of opportunity was beyond imagination. However, for Fairy Jia Yu and her son, who planned to enter the place of opportunity but did not have any hope of leaving, this was obviously a great surprise. A 25% chance of success was dozens of times better than the original 1% chance of success. Fairy Jia Yu took the spiritual light, and her eyes flashed with countless rays of enlightenment. In a trance, she seemed to have understood a lot, but also seemed to have understood nothing. In the end, all the changes converged into a very strange action sequence that she couldn't even understand until now. Chapter 25:47. This kind of procedure was too difficult to understand. She couldn't even believe that it was a procedure. If she wasn't sure that a powerhouse like Luo Fan wouldn't make such a mistake, she would suspect that Luo Fan had sent her a meaningless message. Perhaps we'll find out after we enter the land of fortune. That was the only thing Fairy Jia Yu could think of in the end. At this moment, her son looked at Fairy Jia Yu expectantly, hoping to see if the message was useful from her face. Based on his understanding of his mother, he could see the subtle confusion in her eyes at a glance. He was both expectant and hesitant. Obviously, he was also doubting if the message was useful. Luo Fan didn't care about this. He merely said, "I only hope that the two of you can find fellow Xian smoothly." Hearing this, Fairy Jia Yu came back to her senses. She had a grateful expression on her face. "Thank you for your kind words." No matter what, Luo Fan had given them the hope of leaving the land of fortune. Even if the possibility of leaving was immeasurable, it was still enough to express his goodwill. Since he had already expressed enough goodwill, they naturally had to respond. Luo Fan only smiled and nodded. He was also looking forward to it. He gave the method to leave the land of fortune to Fairy Jia Yu. Apart from helping her, it was more important to see if this method would work. After all, his previous deductions about the land of fortune were only based on the method to enter. As for what the land of fortune looked like, whether the method of leaving that place that was deduced based on the method of entering was realistic, and whether it could really allow living beings to leave that land of fortune, he was still unsure of all these things. Under such circumstances, if a cultivator could use his method to leave the land of fortune, it would be enough to prove that many of his deductions were correct. This would allow him to be confident that the results he deduced based on these deductions were trustworthy. Under such circumstances, how could he not look forward to Fairy Jia Yu and her son's actions? At this moment, Fairy Jia Yu and her son thanked Luo Fan at the same time. Their powers joined together, and they began to move according to the method of entering the land of opportunity. The method was rather complicated. It required a corresponding position, a corresponding environment, and a corresponding power to operate according to the corresponding method. If it was an ordinary living being, perhaps it would take them thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years just to satisfy the conditions to enter the land of opportunity. However, it was clear that this was not a problem for a cultivator like Jiayu Fairy, who had gone against the Tao Master's path from the 6th level. Environment? To her, she only needed to think about it, and she could instantly transform it. Power? Naturally, he just needed to separate a bit of it from his own body and convert it. As for the method, needless to say, this kind of traceable method, how could it be difficult for her? With just a glance, she could innovate and come up with hundreds and thousands of similar methods. In this way, in just a few breaths, she had already completed all the prerequisites and began to follow the method of entering to activate the power that she had converted from her body. Following this change, there seemed to be some invisible existence that had pushed aside the endless obstacles and descended into this forbidden area. In that instant, the entire forbidden grounds seemed to be bound by some invisible existence. All changes came to a complete stop in that instant. This was even more powerful than the method that Fairy Jiayu had used to condense time and space. Under this stagnation, that existence slowly materialized. In the end, it turned into a strange beam of light. A beam of light that could suppress all the brilliance in this forbidden area, making all the light in this forbidden area look extremely dim. When this pillar of light appeared, it directly enveloped Fairy Jiayu and her son. This beam of light came from nowhere and directly appeared out of nowhere. It came to a complete stop after enveloping the mother and son. Then, the beam of light rotated slightly and gradually disappeared with the mother and son. At the same time that they disappeared, the invisible existence that had descended from nowhere and directly suppressed the entire forbidden area, causing time and space to completely freeze in this forbidden area. As that invisible existence disappeared, the entire forbidden area returned to normal. It was as if nothing had happened. Everything was so ordinary, so ordinary. The light was still dazzling. The power was still chaotic and terrifying. Everything was the same as before. If that method of leaving is really effective, it shouldn't be long before they appear in front of me. At this moment, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, a look of anticipation appeared on his face. The method he had constructed to leave the land of opportunity contained the mysteries of time and space. As long as that method was used, not only could it be transferred in space, it could also be transferred in time. In other words, no matter how long Fairy Jiayu and her son stayed in the land of opportunity, even if it was billions of trillions of years, when they left the land of opportunity and returned to the Tao Master Path, they would appear in front of Luo Fan. Moreover, it wouldn't be too long from now. In other words, if they didn't show up in the next period of time, it meant that they didn't want to leave the place of opportunity. Or the method of leaving the land of opportunity had failed. Now, all Luo Fan had to do was wait. As for why the method of leaving could not only be transferred in space, but also in time, the reason was very simple. It was because the land of opportunity was in a state of chaos. It was separated from the Tao Master Path by the true state of chaos. Because of the state of chaos, the time and space in these two places were actually independent of each other. In other words, in the land of opportunity, billions of trillions of years might be equivalent to a moment in the Tao Master Path, or it might be equivalent to billions of trillions of years here. It might even be the past of the Tao Master Path that did not know the value of time. This characteristic was a fixed characteristic between different perfect worlds and different big worlds. Of course, this state of chaos had some kind of extremely mysterious space-time dimension controlling everything, so that the different perfect worlds and different big worlds still followed some kind of space-time flow rule at a deeper level, so that there would not be some kind of irreversible chaos. In other words, for existences at the true saint level, the space-time between different big worlds and different perfect worlds might look different in their eyes. However, that was only for true saints who could truly understand the state of chaos. For existences below the true saint level, the time between different big worlds and different big worlds that were separated by the state of chaos was a kind of almost completely chaotic state. In this way, through some methods, it was naturally possible to control the point of time after one stepped into another world that was separated by the state of chaos. For the current Luo fan, his own ability was naturally unable to directly control this point. However, with the characteristics of the land of fortuitous chance and the method he comprehended from the method of entering, the method of using the land of fortuitous chance's power allowed him to cross the boundary between the impossible and the possible, allowing him to achieve the effect of controlling the point of time. As for whether this would succeed or not, it would naturally depend on the changes in the next period of time. After all, Luo Fan was only borrowing the ability of the land of opportunity, but he did not truly use his own ability to control the landing point of this point of time. Therefore, he was unable to achieve absolute precision in controlling the landing point. The result was that the Jiayu Fairy and the others had once again returned to the point where the Tao Master Path might appear, although he had already tried his best to confirm that it would happen in the next extremely short period of time. However, because of the existence of errors and the like, this extremely short period of time would be extended. With Luo Fan's current level of understanding of a land of opportunity, the time point that could originally be within a few breaths of time might have an error of about 100 years. In other words, if it was truly accurate, the result of whether the Jiayu Fairy had left the land of opportunity would be known in a few breaths of time. However, because of the error, Luo Fan still had to wait for 100 years. It was not until 100 years later, when the Jiayu Fairy really did not appear, that he was able to confirm that the Jiayu Fairy really did not succeed in leaving the land of opportunity. However, for Luo Fan, 100 years was naturally nothing. Therefore, to be able to be accurate to this extent was actually already enough to make him satisfied. In the following period of time, Luo Fan had been staying here, quietly waiting for the Jiayu Fairy to reappear. Outside the forbidden area, one could feel a powerful aura rushing towards the forbidden area. Among these powerful auras, there were even many auras that contained characteristics that did not belong to the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. These people had discovered that Luo Fan's Tower Continent could successfully allow the cultivator to transcend the Tower Continent and truly enter the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. Therefore, they had specially rushed over from the various levels. As for the appearance of these cultivators, Luo Fan completely ignored them. He was just cultivating while waiting for the Jiayu Fairy. After a few days, the fastest cultivator appeared in front of Luo Fan. This was a cultivator from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. In fact, he had already transmitted his voice to Luo Fan outside the forbidden area, expressing his intentions for coming. At that time, Luo Fan did not care much about his arrival. He was not very enthusiastic about it, nor did he reject it. However, he obediently followed Luo Fan's rules and followed the structure of the forbidden area, moving forward step by step, and finally arrived in front of Luo Fan. This kind of attitude put himself in a very ordinary position, the position of a cultivator on the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path. After the cultivator arrived in front of Luo Fan, he said respectfully, "I am Taoist Tisha. Greetings, Taoist friend. Greetings, Taoist friend. Since Taoist friend is here, you must know the rules. I wonder if fellow Taoist is ready?" Luo Fan said. Naturally, Luo Fan did not have a good impression of this kind of cultivator who waited for the final result to appear before coming. But no matter what, the other party obediently followed his rules, which was enough to give him face. Naturally, he would not treat him coldly. Taoist Tisha said with a smile, "Of course I'm ready. I have a way to enter a place of opportunity built together by the 72 large worlds. Please accept it, Taoist friend." As he spoke, he sent over a spiritual light that turned into a beautiful jade, which directly arrived in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. The spiritual light fell into his hand, and the information inside flowed into his heart. allowing him to instantly grasp a way to enter a certain place of opportunity. Luo Fan had studied this way of entering a place of opportunity for tens of millions of years, so he was naturally very familiar with it. At this time, he knew that this way of entering was real and useful. It was even to the extent that he'd understood some of the characteristics of that place with just a single glance, and he'd sensed exactly how compatible that place was with him. Compatibility. This was a characteristic that Luo Fan concluded after studying the way to enter those places of opportunity over the years. If the compatibility was compatible, it meant that this place of opportunity was suitable for him. If the compatibility was incompatible, it meant that the place of opportunity was not suitable for him. The higher the compatibility, the higher the degree of suitability. He had studied the previous places of opportunity that were compatible with him one by one. Among them, the one with the highest compatibility was actually the most special place. Just the way to enter was enough to manipulate the memory of a cultivator. Based on this theory, this place of opportunity was indeed quite wonderful, but it was not very compatible with him. In other words, the value of this place of opportunity was actually only to increase the foundation of his research on the place of opportunity. If he wanted to make great progress through this place of opportunity, he could not even think about it. At least, compared to the path of Tao Master, the effect of the place of opportunity was probably much worse. Understanding this, Luo Fan did not feel too disappointed. After all, it was extremely difficult to find a place of opportunity that was compatible with one's own nature. Most of the places of opportunity were ultimately not compatible with one's nature. Now that there was a place of opportunity, it was actually extremely rare. Immediately, he said to Taoist Hisha, Taoist friend, please go ahead. Chapter 2548. After arriving here, Taoist Hisha pointed with his finger, and a mysterious power enveloped the three women and sent them directly into the continent of the tower ahead. After entering the continent of the tower, the three women appeared directly on the first layer of the continent, turned into three innate zenith heaven cultivators, and began to look around curiously. Luo Fan glanced at them and knew that only two of the three women were related to Taoist Hisha by blood. The other one was not related to Taoist Hisha by blood. It was very obvious that out of these three women, only two were his daughters or other distant descendants. The other one was most likely his wife. As for why a cultivator from the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path would have a wife who was not even qualified to step into the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path, he was not surprised at all. After all, for a sixth tribulation expert like Taoist Isha, creating heaven and earth, creating worlds, and creating living beings was really just a matter of thinking. Under such circumstances, he developed feelings for the creatures he created and had children. What was so surprising about that? With his previous experience, Luo Fan no longer had any doubts about whether the continent of the tower could satisfy Taoist Isha. At this time, he did not pay attention to those changes. At this time, he was just carefully studying the method to enter a certain place of opportunity that he had obtained from Taoist Isha. His current research on the most important place of opportunity had reached a bottleneck. This obviously meant that the accumulation brought to him by the methods to enter the places of opportunity had been used up. In this way, if he wanted to make progress, he naturally had to accumulate more. In other words, he had to obtain more methods to enter the places of opportunity. Taoist Hisha's method of entry was obviously the same as asking for trouble. Compared to Fairy Jiayu, who was always paying attention to her son in the continent of the tower, Taoist Isha was obviously more carefree. At this time, after sending his wife and daughter into the continent of the tower, he only paid a little attention to them before turning around and stepping into the city next to the continent of the tower, which was becoming more and more famous in the entire fifth layer of the Tao Master's path. Soon, he obtained the right to settle down in the city with his own ability and began to enjoy a special life of cultivation in the city. For Taoist Isha, who came from the sixth level of the road to Tao Master, the cultivation environment in this city was obviously far from meeting his needs. Therefore, to him, the life of cultivation in this city was just an enjoyment. Of course, that was only for a short period of time. If this went on for too long, even Taoist Hisha's patience would be exhausted. At that time, living here would no longer be enjoyable, but torturous. Fortunately, the flow of time in the continent of the tall tower was extremely distorted. Even if his wife and daughter needed billions of years to transcend the continent of the tall tower, it would only take him hundreds of thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, or even thousands of years were nothing to Taoist Isha. Even if it was the most arduous torment, he could still endure it. Not to mention that it was a kind of enjoyment at the beginning. Following the arrival of Taoist Isha, other cultivators rushed in one after another to see Luo Fan in person. Most of these cultivators came from the 6th level of the road to Tao Master. Only a small number came from the 5th level, and even fewer came from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master. Their intentions for coming here were all similar. They were here for their friends and relatives. Luo Fan did not refuse these cultivators. As long as they could pay him a satisfactory price, he would let them enter the continent of the tall tower and send their relatives and friends there. Perhaps because Jiayu Fairy had set the price, these cultivators generally gave Luo Fan the way to enter a certain place of opportunity as a reward. Moreover, almost none of them were repeated. Of course, it was only almost. Even if there were occasional repeats, the cultivators would just change the way to enter a place of opportunity. This also showed why, among the cultivators who came here, there were fewer cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master than on the 6th level. It was because the reward was too precious and rare for cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. After all, the way to enter the place of opportunity was common on the 6th level. On the 5th floor, aside from Luo Fan, who was a trade item that could tempt cultivators of the 6th floor, it was extremely difficult for other cultivators to obtain the method to enter this place of opportunity. It was almost impossible. Under such circumstances, it was actually very rare for so many cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master to come here to trade with Luo Fan. As for the cultivators on the 7th level of the road to Tao Master, the reason was even more simple. This was because it was too difficult for cultivators on the 7th level of the road to Tao Master to appear on the 5th level. Under such a difficult situation, even if they traded with Luo Fan, they could not guarantee that the transaction would be carried out properly. If Luo Fan turned against them in the end, it would be difficult for them to deal with Luo Fan. As a result, they naturally came down very rarely. After these cultivators sent their friends and relatives to the continent of the tower, most of them entered the city next to the continent of the tower. However, there is also a small portion like Fairy Jiayu, who directly watched how their friends and relatives cultivated and survived in the continent of the tower. Under such circumstances, the city next to the continent of the tower was unknowingly raised by a few levels. In the 5th level of the road to Tao Master, it became even more famous, and it became even more attractive to the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. The reason for this was very simple, because there were many cultivators from the 6th level of the road to Tao Master. Although these cultivators did not come to bring warmth to the cultivators on the 5th level, their existence was already a great opportunity for the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. There is no need for the cultivators on the 6th level of the road to Tao Master to say anything or do anything. As long as they were here, they would be able to greatly enlighten the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. They would be able to comprehend many things from their auras, temperaments, and even their appearances. In fact, many cultivators had obtained certain breakthroughs because of this and even ascended because of it. Of course, only the cultivators on the 6th level of the road to Tao Master could give them such benefits. In contrast, although there were many cultivators from the 7th level, they did not mean much to the cultivators on the 5th level. This was because the gap between them and the cultivators on the 5th level was simply too great. This gap was so great that the cultivators on the 5th level could not understand what kind of existence they were. Under such circumstances, unless the cultivators on the 7th level were willing to guide them, They would not be able to comprehend anything even if they interacted with the cultivators on the 7th level day and night. Not to mention that the cultivators from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master had to pay a great price to be able to go against the flow. As a result, the time they could stay on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master for a long time was not long. Everyone had to do their best to restrain their aura and power when they stayed on this level. In this way, even if they existed, even if they appeared in front of the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master, they would probably turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to them. Naturally, they would not be able to comprehend their profoundness. Time passed quickly, and soon 70 years had passed. After 70 years of continuous trading, Luo Fan had obtained a total of 103 methods to enter the land of opportunity. Compared to the few types at the beginning, there was a world of difference between this and the few types at the beginning. This was more than enough for him to build a foundation to comprehend the method to enter the land of opportunity, which was enough to affect the memories of the person who obtained it. Therefore, Luo Fan no longer had a strong desire to trade with other cultivators to obtain more methods to enter the land of opportunity. In the past, whenever a cultivator came, he would take the initiative to trade with them. Now, he could not be bothered to pay attention to them. Even if a cultivator came to trade with him, he would still stay in his cave mansion to study the method to enter the land of opportunity. When those cultivators found his cave abode, he reluctantly came to trade with them. In this way, the efficiency of the trade was much lower. On this day, the entire Forbidden Grounds suddenly became slightly sluggish, as if some invisible existence had suddenly suppressed the entire Forbidden Grounds. All the light in the Forbidden Grounds seemed to have been frozen, unable to move in the slightest. At this moment, the expressions of the cultivators who had traded with Luo Fan changed slightly, whether they were inside or outside the city. Who dares to be so arrogant? A cultivator from the 7th level was furious. In his opinion, the only person who could completely suppress the entire forbidden area was a cultivator from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. If he was not here, he would naturally be happy to see this happen. He would be happy to see Luo Fan suffer, and he would be happy to see the forbidden area be unable to resist the cultivators from the 7th level. However, he was already here, and his friends and relatives were already in the land of the Tall Tower. They were working hard to cultivate, trying their best to transcend the land of the Tall Tower. Under such circumstances, the situation was obviously completely different from when he was not here. Now, to him, this suppression was no longer just targeted at Luo Fan. It was not just the forbidden area, but him and his friends and relatives. This was, of course, unforgivable. At this moment, the cultivators from the 7th level ignored the great restrictions on the 5th level. As their auras surged, they fiercely attacked the existence that was suppressing the forbidden area. They wanted to teach that existence a lesson. However, soon, a look of horror appeared on their faces. The moment their auras rushed up, they felt as if an egg had smashed into a stone. It was as if the egg had been completely smashed. There was even a shocking counterforce that fiercely rushed towards them and hit them crazily. At this moment, the embodiments of 2 cultivators from the 7th level collapsed, and their minds returned to the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. What is this? How can it be so strong? Is there an expert from the 8th level who dares to commit such a heinous crime? The cultivators from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path could not believe what they had sensed, and their faces were filled with inexplicable horror. For them, the only person who could so easily defeat them was a cultivator from a higher level. This was what they could not understand. After all, to go against the law of the Tao Master's path by 1 level was already a great price to pay. To go against the law of the Tao Master's path by 2 levels, even for them, they would have to grit their teeth and make a great decision. They would only dare to do it if they had no other choice. And to go against the law of the Tao Master's path by 3 levels? This was not something they could even dream of. If they were to go against the law of the Tao Master's path by just using a projection, their bodies might be completely erased by the power of the Tao Master's path in the first world. Under such circumstances, when they suspected that there was an existence from the 8th level of the Tao Master's Path going against the law of the Tao Master's Path, they could not believe it and did not dare to imagine it. When they thought of this, they no longer dared to have any arrogant thoughts in their hearts. Each and every one of them seemed to have turned into a partridge, not daring to move at all. They even tried to restrain their auras, strength, and momentum as much as possible. They even restrained their auras more tightly than when they originally wanted to avoid the counterforce of the Tao Master's Path. Although they could not believe that an expert from the 8th level of the Tao Master's Path would go against the law of the Tao Master's Path, the fact was now in front of them. That kind of power was not something they could compare with or even imagine. Under such circumstances, even if they did not believe it, they could only accept it. At this time, Luo Fan naturally also sensed this change. At this moment, a strong look of surprise appeared on his face. In a flash, he had already appeared at the place where the existence that suppressed the entire forbidden area had landed. It's finally here. It seems that my speculation was correct. He looked up at the place filled with boundless light, and such a thought flashed through his mind. At this time, the invisible existence continued to press down, and the entire forbidden area began to tremble slightly. Chapter 25:49. At this moment, the entire forbidden area began to tremble visibly. There were even traces of strange cracks appearing in the mobile net all over the forbidden area. It looked as if the fundamental structure of the entire forbidden area was beginning to be damaged, and the entire forbidden area was gradually beginning to collapse. Then, at the moment when the entire forbidden area was about to be completely destroyed, the terrifying pressure instantly disappeared. Then, as if time and space had been broken, 3 broken figures directly appeared in front of Luo Fan. The invisible existence that had been brewing for a long time had completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Taoist He Xian. At this moment, a cultivator from the 7th level of the road of Tao Master exclaimed in surprise. However, the moment he realized that the terrifying pressure had completely disappeared, he had already clearly seen who one of the 3 people here was. These 3 broken figures were the family of 3 of Taoist He Xian. Of course, with their current level of damage, the combined body parts of the 3 of them were probably not as much as one person. Although it was said to be 3 people, it was only calculated based on the nature of their spiritual intelligence. In terms of body size, they could only be counted as half a person. At this moment, the 3 of them looked around. When they sensed the endless light around them, as well as the faint smile on Luo Fan's face not far in front of them, their eyes showed a relaxed look, as if they had finally put down the hundreds of millions of kilograms of burden they were carrying. Thanks to the method you imparted to us, otherwise my family of 3 would have died in that place of opportunity. At this moment, Jiayu Fairy said to Luo Fan. At this moment, Jiayu Fairy only had half of her head, neck, chest, and 1 arm left. She was in such a sorry state that no one could connect her to Fairy Jiayu, who had entered the land of fortuitous encounters decades ago. But even so, she was already the most complete of the 3 of them. There's no need to say anything else. Fellow Taoists, heal your injuries first, Luo Fan said to them. The injuries suffered by the 3 of them were obviously not caused by ordinary means. After all, if it was an injury caused by an ordinary method, with the strength of a 5th tribulation expert, even the weakest of the 3 sons, they only needed to think about it, or maybe they didn't even need to think about it, and they would completely recover. Since they still hadn't recovered, it meant that their injuries weren't simple. It wasn't something that could be healed with such a method. Instead, they needed some special methods to recover. The injuries we suffered are quite severe. If we want to recover, we'll have to rely on your continent. I hope you can help us, Taoist He Xian said. A look of shame appeared on his battered face. He seemed to be extremely embarrassed about his insatiable greed. Luo Fan naturally had no objections to his request. Although they had suffered great losses in the land of opportunity and might have even lost 90% of their lives, they had still taken a stroll around the land of opportunity. Under such circumstances, they were obviously aware of the various details of the Land of Opportunity. If Luo Fan obtained these details and compared them with the general situation of the Land of Opportunity that he had studied previously, he would definitely be able to have a deeper understanding of the connection between the method of entering the Land of Opportunity and the true appearance of the Land of Opportunity. At that time, he would definitely be able to make great progress in his research on the method to enter the Land of Fortuitous Fortune that he had only studied 80% of. Even if he didn't completely study the method to enter the Land of Fortuitous Fortune, he would definitely make great progress. Faced with such a situation, how could he be inhumane to the family of three? Not to mention that the family of three needed his help now. Even if they didn't need his help, he would still create opportunities for them to help him so that they would owe him a favor. That way, he would have a reason to make them tell him everything they had seen, heard, and felt in the Land of Opportunity. Although he was eager to obtain the information, he was naturally not in a hurry. At this moment, Luo Fan had a slight thought. With a wave of his hand, the family of three had already turned into 3 streams of light and rushed straight towards the mainland of the tall tower. In the blink of an eye, they had completely rushed into it and directly followed the reincarnation of the tall tower's mainland, reincarnating on the first level of the mainland of the tall tower. If they were complete cultivators, this kind of reincarnation would naturally only take a very short time, at least an instant. The long time would only be like the time needed for ordinary living beings to conceive and give birth. However, it was obvious that the family of three were not complete living beings at this time. Their current appearance was simply dilapidated to the point of no return. Under such circumstances, with the help of the reincarnation of the tall tower's mainland, there was indeed a chance for them to recover and make up for everything they had lost. However, the time needed for that was completely different from the time needed for ordinary living beings to reincarnate. Even though the flow of time on almost every level of the tall tower's mainland had been distorted to the point that it was trillions of times faster than the outside world, Luo Fan still spent thousands of years outside the tall tower's mainland before he saw them truly born. Compared to the time in the tall tower's mainland, these thousands of years were calculated in billions of trillions of years. Even if it was billions of trillions of years as the unit of measurement, this number was still an incredibly astronomical figure. After such a long time, with the help of the reincarnation power of the tall tower's mainland, Daoist He Xian's family of three were finally born in the center and truly appeared on the first level of the tall tower's mainland. After that, the three of them quickly reunited. When they saw that each other had recovered, the three of them each let out a long sigh of relief, as if they had completely let go of their biggest burden. Since they had just been born, their strength was naturally limited. If they wanted to borrow the reincarnation power of the tall tower's mainland, they would ultimately have to pay a sufficient price. As for the injuries they had suffered, the price they had to pay was all their strength and all their might. In the end, after the three of them were born, their strength was only at the level of a normal, relatively powerful living being. They were still quite a distance away from the itinerant immortal realm, let alone comparable to their original strength. However, there was also an advantage to this. That was, they did not need to be restricted by the tall tower's mainland like the foreign cultivators. Instead, they had the characteristics of the native cultivators and could cultivate and break through like the native cultivators. This saved them the process of establishing and ending karma with the world and allowed them to cultivate wholeheartedly. Through this kind of cultivation, in the next tens of thousands of years, they broke through realms one after another and directly became tribulation cultivators. This was not the time in the outside world, but the time in the tall tower's mainland. To Luo Fan, this period of time was only a very short period of time. In fact, it was only a few breaths. Looks like it won't be long before they return. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable smile on his face. For the family of three who were not restricted by the tall tower's mainland, they did not need much help from the outside world for their breakthroughs after becoming tribulation cultivators. Just by relying on their own memories, their own remnant cultivation comprehension, and some primers, they could already break through layer by layer. In the end, just as Luo Fan had expected, in just a few hundred years in the outside world, the family of three had advanced together and directly broke through the 998th level of the Tall Tower's mainland. They were qualified to enter the 999th level and also qualified to pursue the final opportunity. However, like the Tao ancestor and the others before, the family of three did not choose to continue to pursue the final opportunity. Instead, they escaped from the 999th level and the Tall Tower's mainland, as if they were running away, and reappeared outside the Tall Tower's mainland. Because they were completely unrestricted when they left the Tall Tower's mainland, the family of three had already condensed almost perfect heaven and earth light. The light, which was as clear as water and seemed to be alive, covered their bodies, allowing them to come and go as they pleased in this forbidden area. Luo Fan secretly sighed with emotion at the performance of the three of them. Among the three of them, Fairy Jiayu and Taoist He Xian obviously had the strength to go further. In other words, as long as they were willing, they only needed to make a slight push to naturally make a breakthrough in their cultivation realm and become sixth tribulation cultivators. However, once they did so, they would obviously be forced to ascend to the sixth level of the Tao Master's path and be separated from their son once again. Obviously, they, who had finally been able to cultivate and make a breakthrough together with their son, would never make such a choice. Because of this, the husband and wife were able to maintain such a realm. As for their son, this kind of almost perfect heaven and earth light was obviously the peak he could achieve. Furthermore, this was most likely because he had reaped some benefits from the land of opportunity. At this moment, the family of three appeared in front of Luo Fan and solemnly bowed to Luo Fan to express their gratitude. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "You should also know that what I did before was to test my method, so this kind of gratitude is not necessary. If fellow Taoists feel bad about it, then I only need you to tell me what you saw and heard in that place of fortune. Of course, I don't need any information that involve your privacy." Hearing this, the family of three was not very surprised. His gratitude towards Luo Fan did not decrease in the slightest. After all, although it was in the nature of an experiment, this kind of experiment at least brought them great benefits, so that the family of three could safely leave the place of opportunity and even have a chance to reunite again. No matter what, this was a kind of kindness. As experts, they could not forget this kind of kindness just because of Luo Fan's intention. At this moment, Taoist He Xian just said, "It's difficult to repay your kindness with just these. I heard that you're looking for ways to enter the place of opportunity. I have a few ways to enter the place of opportunity, so I will give them to you as a token of my gratitude." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. Rays of spiritual light rushed out of his hand and condensed into a ball of beautiful jade in the void. Among them, there was a ray of spiritual light that was tens of thousands of times brighter than the others. It felt like a sun had been forcibly condensed into the shape of a beautiful jade. As for the rest of the spiritual light, although it was far inferior to the spiritual light that was like the sun, its quality was quite extraordinary. It was not dazzling, but it could make people feel enlightened at first glance. In total, there were more than 20 spiritual lights. The bright and dazzling spiritual light that was like the sun obviously contained what Taoist He Xian had seen, heard, and felt about the place of opportunity. As for the rest of the spiritual lights, they were the ways to enter the place of opportunity. No wonder he is an expert on the 7th level of the road of Tao Master. He actually obtained so many ways to enter the place of opportunity. Luo Fan looked at the spiritual lights and thought to himself. However, he did not refuse politely. He immediately thanked Taoist He Xian and took the spiritual lights. When the spiritual lights appeared in his hand, he instantly swept through them and absorbed all the information contained in them. Just as he had thought, the brightest and most dazzling spiritual light was none other than what Taoist He Xian had seen, heard, and sensed in the land of fortune. In fact, it wasn't just him. It also included what his wife and child had seen, heard, and sensed. Of course, As Luo Fan had requested, many secrets about the three of them had been excluded. Through this information, Luo Fan could only understand the situation of the place of opportunity, but he did not know what the three of them had done in the place of opportunity, what they had obtained, and what they had suffered. This was obviously extremely useful to Luo Fan. However, this was obviously not the time to study it in detail. Next, he swept through the remaining more than 20 ways to enter the place of opportunity. This time, he could not help but feel a little disappointed. Among them, nearly 70% had been obtained by Luo Fan. Only less than 30%, or even less than 10 ways to enter the place of opportunity, were things that he had not obtained before. However, this was an unexpected gain after all. Luo Fan did not feel too disappointed because of this. After collecting all the spiritual lights, he once again expressed his gratitude to the three of them, saying that they were useful to him. Chapter 2550. Daoist Tixian's family of three did not stay in the forbidden area. Daoist Tixian was originally an expert from the 7th level of the Tao Sovereign's path, but he obviously did not appear on the 7th level from the very beginning. He must have ascended through the 1st layer, the 2nd layer, the 3rd layer, and so on before finally arriving at the 7th layer. He had naturally stayed on the 5th level before. Moreover, he must have stayed there for a long time. Daoist Tixian was like that, and Fairy Jiayu was even more so. She had also spent a long time on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, the couple naturally left many traces on the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In the past, because they went against the flow, they did not have the mood to look for the traces they left on the 5th level. However, now, they had to go through the cultivation process of the 5th level again and try to ascend again. Their mentality was naturally completely different from being passers-by. They needed to settle down on the 5th floor, search for opportunities in the 5th floor again, and cultivate again in the 5th floor. Since that was the case, he naturally couldn't miss the traces left behind in the past. Even though it would take Fairy Jiayu hundreds of trillions of years to calculate when she left the 5th level, the traces they left behind in the 5th level had not completely disappeared. With Daoist Tixian's perception, he even directly found a cave mansion that he had left behind on the 5th level. In this way, the family of three naturally had a place to go. Soon, they disappeared from Luo Fan's perception. Luo Fan did not care about their departure at all, because he had already obtained what he wanted from the family of three. Under such circumstances, the family of three's departure was actually a good thing for Luo Fan. It allowed Luo Fan to have more time and experience to focus on what he had gained. Just as Luo Fan was about to return to his cave mansion and resume his research, a cultivator from the 7th level of the Tao Sovereign's path came from afar. "Fellow Taoist, please wait," the expert said. An expert from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master naturally could not step into the 5th level with his real body. However, what had appeared here was the same as when Daoist Tixian had appeared for the first time. He had also relied on a strand of aura to form a clone. However, it was from the 7th level after all. Even though it was just a clone formed from a stream of aura, it was still nearly invincible against the cultivators on the 5th level. Because of this, cultivators had very few scruples in the forbidden area. Previously, when he saw Luo Fan, he did not show too much respect. He only reluctantly gave Luo Fan some equal treatment because of the deal. But now, when he faced Luo Fan, he showed respect that he had never shown before. From afar, he already had a smile plastered on his face. Although he didn't have to bow and scrape, he had already placed Luo Fan above him. "What's the matter, fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan said without any trace of politeness. He was now in a hurry to go to his cave abode to study the information he had obtained from Daoist Tixian, so he did not have the mood to chat with other cultivators. Hearing this, the expert just smiled and said, "I think the person you met before was Daoist Tixian. Am I wrong?" Luo Fan nodded lightly and said, "You're not wrong, fellow Taoist. But so what? Could it be that you have a grudge against fellow Daoist Tixian?" Hearing this, the cultivator just said, "Fellow Taoist, you've misunderstood. Although I don't have much friendship with Daoist Tixian, there's no grudge between us. This time, I came to see you because I want you to give me some pointers on how I can return to the 5th level to cultivate again like Taoist Xian. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He carefully sized up the cultivator again. He naturally remembered this cultivator. He was one of the few cultivators who had appeared in the forbidden area against the flow of time, and he clearly remembered the deal he had with him. He remembered that the cultivator in front of him had not sent his children into the continent of the tall tower, but his wife, a peerless beauty whose cultivation realm was only equivalent to a pseudo-sage. Looking at how he had been when he had sent her in, he had been worried, expectant, and happy. It was obvious that he had loved his wife to the bone. In this way, the intention of this expert to bring up this idea at this time was very obvious. He wanted to stay with his wife forever. As for why he was so eager, there was no need to explain. Even if his wife could transcend the continent of the tall tower and be completely accepted by the entire Tao Venerate path, she could only appear on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path. If she wanted to ascend to the 7th level, even if everything went smoothly, it would still take hundreds of millions of years. If things did not go smoothly, this time might be extended to an eternity. After all, not every cultivator could ascend to the 6th level. There are so many cultivators on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path, but only a small portion of them could ascend to the 6th level. And this small portion of them could ascend to the 7th level, and it was an extremely small portion of them. Under such circumstances, how could he guarantee that his wife could ascend to the 7th level? Could be a very, very small part of this small part. Since he could not guarantee this, as a cultivator who loved his wife to the bone, he naturally wanted to cultivate on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path with his wife. He wanted to personally accompany and guide his wife. However, it was obvious that this was just an extravagant hope for him. At the very least, before he met Taoist Xian, he felt that it was an extravagant hope. The general trend of the Tao Venerate path was to ascend step by step. If one wanted to go against the Tao Venerate path, they would have to go against the general trend. The price one had to pay to go against the general trend was self-evident. Unless he could become as powerful as a true saint, death would be the only outcome for him. However, he was shocked to find that Taoist Xian had actually returned to the 5th level, and he looked no different from a real 5th Tribulation expert on the 5th level. He had also been accepted by the Tao Venerate path, and could also ascend like a normal 5th Tribulation expert. How could he not be surprised? How could he suppress the desire in his heart? It could be said that the cultivator had waited for such a long time before coming to ask Luo Fan, instead of asking Luo Fan when Taoist Xian was still on the continent of the Tall Pagoda. This was already considered to be an extremely prudent cultivator. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he immediately said, "I see. If you want to know the method that Taoist Xian used, I can tell you. However, this method has a slim chance of survival. Even with Taoist Xian's power, he only succeeded because he was extremely lucky. Do you really want it Taoist?" His words caused the 7th Tribulation expert's expression to freeze. Naturally, he could not forget the tragic situation of Taoist Xian's family of 3. It was just that he had originally thought that Taoist Xian might have encountered some enemies and ended up suffering serious injuries. But now, according to what Luo Fan said, this kind of injury was actually the inevitable result of using that method. This made him a little hesitant. He wanted to stay with his wife for a long time, and this kind of feeling was extremely sincere and strong. However, there was a very small chance that he would risk his life for this kind of love, so he had to think about it. Is it really going to be a slim chance of survival? He asked somewhat reluctantly. If we completely follow Taoist Xian's method, it's going to be a slim chance of survival, Luo Fan said resolutely. He was not speaking carelessly. Although he had not truly begun to study the various information, lights, and mysteries of the land of fortuitous encounters that Taoist Xian had given him, he had, after all, roughly looked through it. This was because after looking through it, he naturally had some new understanding of the method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters that he had deduced earlier. He already knew why Taoist Xian's family of 3 had ended up in such a sorry state. In reality, Before the family of three left the land of fortuitous encounters, they had indeed all suffered serious injuries. However, these injuries were not serious enough to make them end up in such a sorry state. At the very least, before they used that method, their bodies had been intact. In this way, one could naturally know that the reason why their bodies had become so badly damaged was because of the method that Luo Fan had given them to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. It could be said that the family of three had great luck. Just now, they did not lose a single person and only suffered serious injuries. If they were to do it again, or if others used this method to leave like them, the chances of them dying would be extremely shocking. Perhaps only 7 or 8 out of 100 people would be able to return safely. This could definitely be considered as having a slim chance of survival. Of course, this was only temporary. If Luo Fan thoroughly studied the situation in the land of fortuitous encounters, he would definitely be able to further modify the method that he had researched to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. This modification would definitely make the method more perfect, and in the end, it would make it even safer. It would also increase the chances of those who used this method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. However, this was obviously not something that needed to be said now. For Luo Fan, there was nothing that he wanted to obtain from the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse in front of him right now. He had already found the method to enter the land of fortuitous encounters that was sufficient for him to use. Since there was nothing that he urgently wanted from the other party, there was naturally no need for him to be too proactive in helping the other party. After all, although he would not need to waste too much time researching the method to leave, he would still waste some time in the end. To him, this amount of time might not be much, but why would he waste his time if it was not necessary? Of course, although he did not want to waste time, he did not lie. In his words, he only said that he would follow the method that Daoist Tixin used, and he did not deny that he could come up with a better method. In fact, this could also be considered a test for the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse in front of him. If the other party was really willing to risk his life in order to stay with his wife for a long time, then he would not be stingy to waste some of his time for such a person. He would help him research a relatively safe method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. After all, an existence that could do this was ultimately worthy of respect. Even if this kind of choice seemed a little silly and foolish in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse naturally did not know that Luo Fan was testing him at this moment. At this moment, he was struggling with his emotions. On one hand, there was a danger that could threaten his life. On the other hand, he could stay with his wife for a long time. These two were like the two ends of a scale that rose alternately. With the thinking ability of a 7th Tribulation Powerhouse, he could come up with trillions of thoughts in an instant. It could be said that a 7th Tribulation expert would be able to give an answer to almost any difficult question in an instant. After all, they would be able to consider the various possibilities of the question tens of thousands of times in an instant. Even if they just relied on exhaustion, they could obtain an answer. However, at this moment, the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse, who had this kind of thinking ability, hesitated in front of Luo Fan for nearly 2 hours. During this process, it was easy to imagine how much he struggled and how uncomfortable he felt. It was easy to imagine how chaotic his thoughts were. In the end, under Luo Fan's curious gaze, the 7th Tribulation Powerhouse still made his decision. He looked at Luo Fan and sighed. Forget it. She won't be willing to risk my life for me. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only sigh to himself. At first, these words sounded very noble and stylish, as if he was completely thinking of his wife. However, in the end, this was actually just an excuse to convince himself. For scumbags in the secular world, almost all selfish decisions could be made with such an excuse. The 7th Tribulation Powerhouse in front of him actually came up with such an excuse after thinking for such a long time. This clearly showed that he did not regard that relationship as more important than his own life, as Luo Fan expected. Although this was understandable, at least this was no longer worthy of Luo Fan's admiration, nor was it worth his time to deduce a way to safely leave that place of opportunity. At this moment, he could only say, I see I understand. As he spoke, he did not stay for long. He nodded at the seventh tribulation powerhouse, turned around, and disappeared in front of him, returning to his cave abode.